Yo, Atlas speaking and welcome to a brand new series on the channel. What if I was reborn in Avatar as Prince Zuko and took over the world? Synopsis: a man from modern-day Earth, beaten down by life and betrayed by the world, finds himself reincarnated into the body of Prince Zuko, the exiled heir of the Fire Nation. At first an enormous shock to the system, he quickly adapted. Armed with memories of a past life and knowledge of this new world's future, he must navigate the treacherous waters of war, politics, and destiny. But as he grapples with his new identity, he realizes that changing the course of history comes with a price. Will he embrace the path of redemption, or will he forge a new legacy, one that could either save the world or plunge it into deeper chaos? Zuko had a legacy to write and a world to experience. Make sure to support the author in the description, and without further ado, let the tale begin. Chapter 1. The Fire Nation Prince. The Fire Nation capital shone like a blazing jewel against a twilight sky. Towers of dark volcanic stone and arches of molten metal reached upward as if trying to catch the last embers of a dying sun. Streets paved with polished obsidian led toward the grand docks, where thousands had gathered. In the heart of the city, every inch of architecture exuded both the lethal precision of war and the opulent pride of a people who knew no equal. Elaborate murals of past victories and fabled conquerors adorned walls, each telling a story of power and ambition that had defined the Fire Nation for generations. At the docks, a sea of Fire Nation dignitaries and noble clans had assembled. High-ranking officials in their meticulously embroidered uniforms, generals boasting gleaming medals, and representatives of every revered house murmured among themselves in a cacophony of anticipation. Their voices, a mixture of hushed reverence and impatient excitement, filled the air as they awaited the return of the exiled prince, a return that promised to reshape the destiny of an empire embroiled in a century-long war. At the center of this charged atmosphere, elevated upon a raised dais, sat one solitary figure on a throne carved from obsidian and inlaid with flickering gold filigree. His presence was unmistakable, tall, stern, and regal beyond measure. His eyes burned with an inner fire, his jaw set in a hard line, and his cloak, a deep, blood-red garment trimmed with the emblems of his house, fell around him like the mantle of authority. Every citizen in attendance recognized the living symbol of Fire Nation dominion. To his left stood a young woman of equal regality. Clad in an impeccably tailored ensemble of crimson and black, her posture was as poised as it was imperious. Her raven hair cascaded in intricate braids, and her eyes, as sharp and cold as freshly forged steel, surveyed the scene with an expression that betrayed little emotion. The whispers among the assembled nobles spoke of her formidable talent and cunning. Every noble clan, each with their own heraldic symbols and storied legacies, had sent their finest to witness this grand occasion. Generals in decorated uniforms, their faces set in grim determination and pride, stood shoulder to shoulder with lords and ladies whose whispered conversations hinted at ancient rivalries and alliances forged in blood. Across the harbor, the horizon darkened as a massive ship emerged from the mist. It was the fabled icebreaker, its hull a strange interplay of frosted silver and iron-red accents that glinted like embers amid the sea's spray. The ship, the very same one that had set Prince Zuko on his ill-fated journey, cut through the waters with a silent majesty. As it drew closer to the docks, the vessel's massive anchor was dropped with a resonant clank, and the ornate bow swung open with a slow, creaking flourish, as if unveiling secrets long held at sea. From the yawning entrance of the ship, a row of 12 firebenders emerged with unwavering discipline. Forming two precise rows of 6, each warrior stood as a testament to the art of flame, stately figures whose controlled embers danced around their fingertips in ceremonial salute. Their presence was both an honor and a reminder, loyalty to the crown was not lightly bestowed. For several long, breath-held moments, silence reigned over the crowd. The only sounds were the gentle lap of the harbor waves and the low murmur of anxious anticipation. Eyes flickered across familiar faces and noble crests, waiting for the figure whose arrival was destined to alter the balance of power. Then, from the ship's darkened interior, stepped forth a man whose presence evoked both nostalgia and an unexpected solemnity. No longer a prince in the eyes of the realm, he moved with measured grace, a former scion whose once bright prospects had dimmed into quiet resignation. His face, weathered by years of both honor and hardship, carried the soft lines of a man who had seen too much to smile freely. His silvered hair was tied back, revealing a gaze that was both wise and mournful, and his uniform, adorned with the faded marks of bygone glory, whispered of battles fought and lost. As he made his way down the gangway, whispers arose from the crowd, mingling praise with bittersweet nostalgia. "The exiled prince returns," murmured one voice, while another added, "a man of honor, whose loss still weighs upon us all." Moments later, the atmosphere transformed into a maelstrom of ecstatic uproar as the true heir to the Fire Nation emerged. Prince Zuko strode onto the dock with the confidence of a man who had both been cast out and found his destiny anew. Every feature of his face told a tale of scars both physical and emotional, the burn mark that traced a path across his cheek, his determined, stormy eyes that seemed to burn with an inner light, and his dark, unruly hair that framed a visage set in steely resolve. Dressed in a battle-worn yet immaculate uniform adorned with the sigils of his royal lineage, he raised his hand in a salute that was both defiant and respectful, acknowledging the rapturous cheers of the assembled throng. But he was not alone. Trailing behind him, with a deliberate, almost forceful gait, was a smaller figure shrouded in a heavy, dark hood. The shorter individual was dragged along as though unwilling to be seen, a mystery hidden behind layers of fabric and shadow. The hood obscured their features, leaving only the hint of determined eyes peeking out, suggesting that even in anonymity, this person was significant. As Prince Zuko advanced, the very air crackled with tension. He marched straight toward the throne, the eyes of the Fire Nation locked upon him. Midway, he paused, his gaze flickering sideways to the young woman seated by his father's throne. For a heartbeat, a mischievous, almost defiant glimmer danced in his eyes, a look that was both provocative and laced with the complexity of unspoken rivalry. The princess returned his gaze with a stare so cold it could have frozen molten lava, her expression an implacable wall of disdain. With measured steps, the prince turned his attention back to the throne. His voice, firm and resonant, cut through the hum of the crowd. "Father, the noble clans of the Fire Nation and the War Council, I have returned, and as promised, I have come with a gift." His words hung in the air, and a ripple of murmurs coursed through the gathered throng. In the fleeting moment when his eyes met those of the ruler on the throne, he detected a spark, a hidden pride, barely visible beneath a veneer of stoic authority. It was as though the man remembered a time when hope had been kindled in the heart of his empire. "Ever since the era of Fire Lord Sozin," Prince Zuko continued, his tone rising with fervor, "we have searched in vain for one individual who could hinder our plans for conquest. I, standing here as Prince Zuko, heir to the Fire Lord, have found that hindrance." His proclamation, laden with both menace and promise, evoked no immediate change in the ruler's impassive expression. Yet the princess beside him could not mask the intense hatred that simmered in her eyes, a storm of contempt barely restrained. A slow, almost imperceptible smile curved Prince Zuko's lips as he shifted his gaze back to the assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his voice echoing power and finality, "for the first time since Avatar Roku, I give to you, the Avatar." At that precise moment, with the force of destiny behind his words, he yanked off the hood with a swift, dramatic motion. Underneath, the concealed captive was revealed, a young boy, barely 12, his skin etched with the unmistakable tattoos of the air nomads. His wide, innocent eyes took in the scene with a mixture of trepidation and wonder, and even the hardened veterans among the crowd could not help but gasp in astonishment. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. The assembled nobles, generals, and common citizens erupted into exultant shouts and wild applause. Some clapped so fiercely that the sound mingled with the crashing of the nearby waves, others whispered fervently about the significance of this revelation, their voices trembling with the promise of change. Even the austere ruler on the throne allowed a fleeting smile of pride to cross his otherwise inscrutable face, a subtle acknowledgment of destiny fulfilled. In that charged moment, the fate of the Fire Nation, and perhaps the world, seemed poised on the edge of a new, uncertain era. The exiled prince had returned not alone, but bearing a gift that would upend centuries of ambition and redefine the balance of power in a land where fire and ice, legacy and rebellion, were forever intertwined. Almost 2 weeks ago. In another world, in another time. The subway car rattled along the tracks, the fluorescent lights above flickering in dull, humming intervals. A young man sat slumped in the corner, his head against the window, watching the blurred city lights streak past like dying stars. His name? It didn't matter. Not anymore. He was just another nobody in the city that never slept, a city that had just chewed him up and spit him out like a bad taste in its mouth. Fired. He let the word roll over in his mind again, bitterness pooling at the back of his throat. He had sacrificed everything for that goddamn job, late nights, missed meals, sleepless weeks, and for what? So that some asshole in a suit could tell him that corporate restructuring meant he was no longer necessary? Bullshit. His jaw clenched, hands gripping his knees tightly. The train screeched to a halt at his stop, and with a sigh, he forced himself up. His whole body felt like lead. He barely had the strength to step off the train and onto the dimly lit platform. The underground was nearly empty. Only a few stragglers wandered about, some half-drunk, some homeless, some just as miserable as he was. None of them spared him a second glance. Why would they? He was just another face in the crowd. Dragging his feet, he made his way up the stairs and out into the open city. The sky was a deep, ink-black void, only interrupted by the neon glow of streetlights and the occasional flicker of a passing car. The air smelled like wet concrete and exhaust fumes. He stood at the curb, waiting for the traffic light to change, his mind still running through every failure that had led him to this point. Then, the rain came. Not a drizzle. Not a light shower. A full-blown outpour. "Are you fucking kidding me?" he growled, pulling his soaked blazer tighter around himself. He looked around, realizing with a sinking feeling that the streets were empty. Completely deserted. No late-night walkers. No passing cabs. No honking horns. Nothing. Just him. And a truck. The headlights burned through the rain like twin suns, growing larger and larger as they approached. At first, he thought nothing of it, just some delivery vehicle making a late run. But something was wrong. It wasn't slowing down. His breath hitched. The truck was coming straight for him. Shit! At the last second, he threw himself out of the way, hitting the wet pavement hard. His elbows scraped against the rough concrete, pain lancing through his arms. He barely had time to catch his breath before he looked up and saw the truck skidding into a hard, screeching 180-degree turn. It stopped. Sat there. Engine rumbling. Headlights still locked onto him. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His heart pounded against his ribs. He could feel the adrenaline flooding his veins. "You crazy motherfucker," he shouted, pushing himself to his feet. His expensive suit, his only suit, was ruined. Soaked. Streaked with mud and grime. He looked down at himself and let out another stream of curses. Fucking great. Just fucking great. Gritting his teeth, he glared at the truck. It hadn't moved. Just sat there like it was watching him. Something inside him snapped. "All right, asshole," he muttered, rolling up his sleeves. "You wanna play? Let's fucking play." He started toward the truck, fists clenched, ready to rip the driver out and beat his face in. Then, the truck moved. Fast. Too fast. He barely had time to react before it lunged toward him, tires screeching, water spraying up from the road like tidal waves. "Oh, fuck!" He leaped to the side again, slamming into a brick wall. Pain exploded across his back. His knees scraped against the sidewalk, blood mixing with rainwater. The truck screeched to another halt. And then, another truck appeared. Nowhere to run. This one was parked right at the entrance of the subway. He froze. Turned his head slowly. The first truck was still there, its engine growling like some kind of mechanical beast waiting to pounce. He turned back. The second truck revved its engine. A deep, gut-wrenching fear clawed at his insides. What the fuck was this? At the same time, both trucks surged forward. His legs locked up. He tried to move. Tried to run. But his body refused to obey. His knees gave out, and he dropped to the ground. The pain was distant now, drowned out by the pure, overwhelming terror that gripped him. This was it. This was how he died. No, no, no! The world blurred into a mess of headlights and rain. Then, impact. A crushing, all-consuming force slammed into him from both sides, bones snapping like twigs, pain erupting in every nerve of his body. His scream never left his throat. Then, nothing. He awoke with a start in a cramped, metallic chamber whose walls gleamed coldly under dim, flickering light. Disoriented, he sat up abruptly on a narrow, iron-framed bed, his mind struggling to piece together the fragments of his last memories, trucks barreling through a torrential downpour, a desperate leap from the path of certain death, and the cacophony of curses echoing in his ears. Yet, despite the chaos of those recollections, there was no sign of any grievous injury. His throat, though, felt parched, as if he'd gulped down tar, and every inch of his body radiated a warmth akin to a sun-drenched afternoon, an odd comfort rather than the expected chill of post-trauma. As he gingerly swung his legs over the edge of the bed, a creeping sensation of unfamiliarity began to settle in. His skin was noticeably lighter, his frame leaner and, disturbingly, a few inches shorter than he remembered. A puzzled hand moved unconsciously to his groin, only to confirm the unthinkable. The part of him he'd always taken as a mark of his identity was diminished, less prominent, a clear sign that this body was not his own. Unsure where he was, he scanned the room. It was a Spartan metal chamber, far different from any hideaway he'd ever known, a small, utilitarian cabin aboard a ship. His eyes landed on a modest nightstand cluttered with a few objects. Driven by an urgent need for answers, he lunged for the drawer, rifling through an assortment of garments. Each piece was meticulously fashioned in shades of red or black, or a bold interplay of both, colors that resonated with an air of authority and tradition. His heart thumped as he finally unearthed a small hand mirror tucked away at the bottom. Cupping the mirror in trembling hands, he stared into his reflection, and nearly gasped out loud. Gazing back was not the tired, withered face of a down-on-his-luck man from New York City. Instead, he beheld the visage of a teenager, a face marred by a distinctive burn scar running along his left eye. The features were both foreign and eerily familiar, as if they belonged to a story he'd once known only from myth and childhood dreams. A sudden, massive shock hit his brain like an avalanche of raw, electric pain. He clutched his head as a guttural scream tore from his throat, and he collapsed onto the cold, unyielding metal floor. As he writhed and squirmed in agony, his mind was assaulted by a deluge of images, hundreds of flashes of a singular, fiery prince, memories not his own flooding in with relentless intensity. The pain was excruciating, each moment stretching into an eternity of torment, until, finally, the assault of visions ebbed into a fragile silence. Gasping for breath, he managed to drag himself back to the narrow bed and, with shaking fingers, retrieved the hand mirror once more. His eyes, still burning with a mix of residual agony and dawning comprehension, slowly traced every detail of his new face. It all came crashing down on him. He was no longer the man who had been beaten down by life in New York. He was Prince Zuko, the exiled heir of the Fire Nation. He began to inspect his body more thoroughly now. His lighter skin, the leaner, almost sinewy build, and even the slight angularity of his features all confirmed the transformation. A distant, almost wistful memory stirred within him, a recollection of childhood afternoons spent watching animated tales of honor, battles, and redemption. He recalled the thrill of watching cartoons, not exactly the explosive epics of DBZ, but the passionate, albeit simpler, narratives of valor that had captivated his young imagination. A bittersweet smile tugged at his lips as he recognized in himself the ghost of that fervent hope. But then, as his eyes roved across his reflection, a new, shattering memory surfaced. A memory of a girl, her presence so potent and her visage so vivid that it froze him in place. A debilitating fear, unlike anything he'd ever experienced, gripped him. It wasn't simply terror, but a paralyzing dread, a reminder of a past so entwined with both pain and longing that even the thought of it stilled his heart. He remembered, with searing clarity, the Agni Kai where the young prince was once summoned to face his father, a duel that had left him with this very scar, and a legacy of complex, conflicted emotions. Strangely, there was no venom of hatred in his heart for the man who had scarred him, rather, it was a cold, frustrated sorrow, a realization of his own perceived weakness in his father's eyes. And the memory of her, of his sister, stoked that inner turmoil further, an unyielding reminder of the personal costs of his destiny. As he sat there, the tumult of his emotions began to settle into a contemplative calm. He thought back over the events that had brought him here, in this most impossible of circumstances. He had died, at least, he believed so, and awoken in the body of Prince Zuko. How and why this had happened was beyond his comprehension, yet the evidence was irrefutable in the mirror's reflection. A new life, fraught with both peril and possibility, now lay before him. A cascade of conflicting thoughts washed over him. There was the life he had known, a miserable existence marked by mob deals, endless disappointments, and a deep-seated sense of failure that had already branded him as a disgrace in his family's eyes. Those miserable memories of his old life, of fucking trucks chasing him through rain-soaked streets, seemed now both terrifying and, in a perverse way, liberating. He remembered how those trucks had been nothing more than a desperate attempt to tie up a loose thread after his firing, a final, chaotic punctuation to his downward spiral. And yet, as his new reflection stared back, he recognized the potential of a fresh start. He could try to piece together this new destiny, to embrace the legacy of a prince and the burdens of an exiled heir. Maybe this was his chance, a break from the life that had left him broken and discarded. Perhaps it was a dream, or some twisted stroke of fate. But in that moment, it felt all too real, and, against every instinct he'd nurtured for survival, it seemed like a goddamn good thing. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot, the echo of his recent screams still whispering in his ears. His mind was a battlefield of memories and raw emotions, regret for what had been lost, fear for what lay ahead, and a tentative hope that this new body, this new identity, could lead him to a future far removed from the one he had once known. Just then, a deep, resonant voice echoed from beyond the metal door, snapping him back from his tumultuous reverie. "Prince Zuko," the voice called out, firm and laden with the authority of tradition and destiny. In that moment, as the weight of his new identity fully settled upon him, he realized that the journey ahead would be one of both triumph and torment, a path fraught with the blazing fires of past mistakes and the uncertain promise of redemption. With a slow, deliberate breath, he wiped away the lingering traces of pain from his eyes, rose to his feet, and steeled himself for the challenges that awaited beyond that cold, metal door. Chapter 2: A Prince's Resolve. A sharp, rhythmic knock rapped against the metal door, followed by the unmistakable voice of a soldier. "Prince Zuko," the man called with practiced discipline. "General Iroh requests your presence on the deck." The young prince, no, the man who had become Zuko, kept his expression schooled as he processed the words. The weight of his new reality pressed against him like an iron vice, but he forced himself to remain composed. He could panic later, if he ever allowed himself such luxury. Right now, the situation demanded intelligence, not reckless emotion. He took a controlled breath before responding, his voice steady. "I'll be there shortly." A slight hesitation followed from the other side of the door before the soldier acknowledged the response. "Understood, Prince Zuko." Footsteps receded down the hall, leaving behind silence. Zuko, because that's who he was now, exhaled slowly and ran a hand down his face. His mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, fragmented memories, and sheer disbelief. But shock and confusion wouldn't serve him right now. If he had somehow been thrown into this world, into this body, then he needed a plan. Think! He was Prince Zuko of the Fire Nation. That much was clear. The exiled prince, the dishonored son, the banished heir searching for an impossible goal, the Avatar. The moment that realization crystallized in his mind, the weight of his predicament truly settled on him. He knew this story. He had watched this story unfold as a child. He also knew how it ended. But now, he wasn't just an observer. He was inside it. He wasn't some passive audience member watching from behind a screen, he was Zuko. which meant every decision from this point forward would shape his fate. Blindly charging ahead, trying to brute force his way through things, wouldn't help. He needed to be smart, methodical. No recklessness. No cowardice. Just careful, strategic moves. His uncle was waiting for him, and that was another factor he had to consider. Iroh wasn't just some supporting character, he was a man of wisdom, a war hero, and, most importantly, one of the few people in Zuko's life who actually cared about him. If there was anyone he needed to be mindful of right now, it was him. Zuko stood up from the bed and approached the nightstand where he had rummaged through the clothes earlier. He pulled out a fresh set of robes, the deep red fabric embroidered with gold accents. He discarded the sleepwear he had woken up in, noting absently how the new clothing fit his leaner frame. As he tied the sash around his waist, he caught his reflection in the small hand mirror once more. The burn mark over his left eye was an ugly reminder of his past, his past. The past of a boy who had suffered humiliation and pain at the hands of his father. A prince who had been cast aside. But was it his past now? The thought made his fingers pause for just a moment before he clenched them into a fist. It doesn't matter. This is who I am now. His jaw tightened as he pushed away the lingering unease. With a final deep breath, he turned and strode toward the door. It's time to meet Uncle Iroh. The corridors of the ship were as metallic and utilitarian as he had expected, the hum of the engine and the occasional clang of footsteps the only sounds accompanying him. He walked with purpose, not rushing but not dawdling either. He needed to establish himself, to project the demeanor of a prince, even if he still felt like an imposter in his own skin. As he ascended the final steps leading to the main deck, the harsh ocean wind greeted him, carrying the scent of salt and smoke. His sharp eyes immediately landed on the figure standing near the railing. Iroh. The older man was exactly as he remembered from the show, broad-shouldered yet relaxed, dressed in traditional Fire Nation armor yet radiating none of the rigid hostility that most of their countrymen did. Instead, his uncle seemed utterly at peace, sipping from a small porcelain teacup as he gazed out over the water. At the sound of approaching footsteps, Iroh turned, his kind eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "Ah, Zuko! You're finally awake." Zuko inclined his head slightly, keeping his expression neutral. "Uncle." Iroh studied him for a moment before gesturing to the open deck. "Come, join me. The sea air is quite refreshing in the morning." Zuko hesitated briefly before stepping forward, coming to stand beside the older man. He kept his posture straight but not rigid, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. He could feel Iroh watching him, assessing him, not in a judgmental way, but with a familiar, knowing gaze. "You were asleep for quite some time," Iroh noted casually. "I was beginning to think I'd have to send for a healer." Zuko exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "I just needed rest. I must have been more exhausted than I realized." Iroh hummed thoughtfully, taking another sip of his tea. "Understandable. You have been carrying quite a heavy burden for some time." Zuko didn't immediately respond. He knew Iroh was testing the waters, trying to gauge his mental state. If there was anyone who could sense something was different about him, it would be his uncle. "I'm fine," he said at last, keeping his tone steady. "But I appreciate your concern." Iroh raised a brow but didn't press further. Instead, he gestured toward the horizon. "It is a long journey ahead, my nephew. Searching for a ghost is no easy task." Zuko nodded slowly. The Avatar. The impossible mission given to him as a means of keeping him out of the Fire Nation indefinitely. A wild goose chase designed to keep him exiled forever. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what to do next. "Have the crew reported anything unusual?" he asked instead, shifting the focus. Iroh looked mildly surprised by the question but answered, "Nothing yet. Though I suspect we will encounter more dead ends than actual leads." He sipped his tea with an air of amusement. "Unless, of course, you have suddenly developed new ways of tracking ancient legends." Zuko allowed himself a small, knowing smirk. "Not yet," he admitted. "But I will." The fire of determination burned in his chest. He didn't know exactly how he was going to handle everything, but one thing was clear: he would not repeat the same mistakes. This was his life now. His story. And he was going to write it on his own terms. Zuko let the conversation settle into a comfortable silence, the wind whistling softly around them as the Fire Nation ship cut through the icy waters. The sight of the frozen landscape stretching endlessly in all directions was both awe-inspiring and foreboding. Massive icebergs drifted in the distance, towering monuments of nature's cruelty. Snow blanketed the world beyond the waves, a stark contrast to the warm reds and golds of his homeland. His homeland. The thought felt almost foreign now. He knew he should long for it, to crave his return with every fiber of his being. But knowing the real Fire Nation, the truth of its war and its conquest, soured the idea in his gut. Blind loyalty won't get me anywhere. If I want to change my fate, I need to be careful. Thoughtful. Smart. He turned his gaze to his uncle. Iroh was still staring out at the waves, his posture relaxed, the steam from his tea curling into the cold air. This was a rare opportunity. If he wanted to understand where Iroh truly stood in all of this, he needed to test him. Casually, Zuko stepped forward and lowered himself onto the wooden crate beside his uncle. "Tea?" he asked. Iroh's mustache twitched upward in a pleased smile. "Ah! You are learning, my nephew." He reached for his teapot, pouring a second cup with practiced ease. A man who drinks tea is a man of patience. And patience is wisdom. Zuko accepted the cup, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. He took a slow sip, using the moment to gather his thoughts. He needed to phrase this right. If he pushed too hard, Iroh would suspect something was off. Carefully, he spoke, his tone casual. "Uncle, what do you think would happen if the Avatar returned?" Iroh didn't react immediately. He simply took another sip of his tea, as if mulling over the question like a fine brew. He sighed, watching the steam rise from his cup. "That is quite the question." Zuko kept his expression neutral. "It's possible, isn't it? The Avatar disappearing for 100 years is already strange, but if he were to resurface now, the world would change." Iroh hummed in agreement. Yes. The world would indeed change. He turned his head slightly to study Zuko, curiosity in his gaze. "But I wonder, why the sudden interest?" Zuko shrugged, keeping his voice level. "It's not sudden. The Avatar is the key to my return, isn't he? My only way home." Iroh's expression didn't shift, but his eyes remained locked on him, as if peeling back layers of thought. Zuko pressed forward. "If I were to find him, if I were to capture him, what then?" He turned his head slightly, looking his uncle in the eye. "Should I bring him back alive? Or dead?" This was it. This was the real test. Because deep down, even if the world saw him as a Fire Nation prince, he wasn't. He was a man from modern-day Earth, and in his world, killing a child was an unforgivable crime. A 12-year-old boy, frozen in ice for 100 years, waking up to a world at war. How could he justify ending a life like that? He knew what Ozai would want. He knew what Zhao would do. But what about Iroh? The older man's eyes darkened ever so slightly, the warm amusement fading just a little. He set his tea down on the wooden railing with a soft clink. "The Avatar is a bridge between worlds," Iroh said finally. His tone was quiet, thoughtful. "He is more than just an enemy or an obstacle. He is balance." Zuko didn't move, letting the words sink in. "If the Fire Nation captured the Avatar," Iroh continued, his voice carrying an almost imperceptible weight, "then the world would face a choice. Capture him alive, and there is a future. Kill him, and you may destroy something far greater than just one man." Zuko inhaled slowly, gripping his cup tighter. "So you believe he should be taken alive?" Iroh studied him once more, as if trying to see past the question itself. Then, a knowing smile tugged at his lips. "That would be the honorable thing to do." Zuko held his gaze, feeling the unspoken weight behind those words. Honor. That was what this had always been about, wasn't it? But whose honor? The Fire Nation's? His father's? His own? Iroh had just given him an answer without outright saying it. If Zuko captured the Avatar alive, he had a chance to dictate what happened next. But if he killed him, he might set something in motion that he could never undo. And deep down, he already knew what choice he had to make. He set his tea down beside Iroh's. Then I'll take him alive. Iroh let out a small chuckle, nodding approvingly. Good. A wise choice, my nephew. He reached for his cup again, taking a long sip before exhaling contentedly. Now, drink your tea before it gets cold. There is no honor in wasting good tea. Zuko allowed himself a small smirk before taking another sip. But in his mind, the pieces were already shifting. He had a direction now. A path. The Avatar was out there, somewhere beneath this frozen wasteland. And when they finally met, things would be different. Because this time, Zuko wasn't going to be a pawn in someone else's game. Chapter 3, The Path Forward. Zuko stood at the prow of the ship, the icy wind biting at his skin as he gazed out over the endless white horizon. His mind was made up. He was going to capture the Avatar. It wasn't just about honor anymore, at least, not the kind his father spoke of. This was about control. He knew how the next few months would unfold, had seen it play out like a story from an old book. Aang's return would change everything. But what no one seemed to realize was that his greatest strength, his unwavering optimism, his naive belief in the goodness of people, was also his greatest weakness. That naivety was what made him dangerous. Because Aang was kind. He was playful. He laughed and joked, and he never wanted to hurt anyone. But when the time came, he would stand against the Fire Nation without hesitation. He would gather allies. He would master the elements. And eventually, he would destroy the Fire Lord. Zuko exhaled, watching his breath disappear into the frigid air. He had to be careful. If he underestimated Aang, if he allowed himself to be dragged into the boy's pace, he could lose everything. He had seen the Avatar's ability to sway people, to turn enemies into allies with nothing but words and kindness. That was a power just as dangerous as firebending itself. No. He couldn't afford to treat this as just a hunt. If he wanted to return home, to change his fate, then he had to play this differently. He had to use everything he knew, not just from Zuko's memories, but from his own knowledge of this world. He turned away from the frozen sea, letting his thoughts shift to the greater threats that loomed ahead. Even if he captured Aang, what then? The world was filled with monsters, and not all of them were spirits. His father, Fire Lord Ozai, was a man who ruled with an iron fist, a master of firebending who had wiped out entire fleets with a single strike. Azula, his younger sister, was a prodigy, a perfectionist, and a natural-born manipulator. At 14, she was already one of the deadliest firebenders alive. Then there was King Bumi of Omashu. A mad genius. A man who could destroy an entire army with the flick of a wrist if he chose to. Master Pakku of the Northern Water Tribe, his skill in waterbending was unmatched, and he commanded a city fortified by ice and warriors who would die to protect it. Zhong Zhong, or Rogue Firebender, someone who had abandoned the Fire Nation yet held a mastery over the flames that few could rival. These were not just names from history. They were real. Living, breathing people, each a force that could shape the war in their own way. And that was just the beginning. Zuko clenched his fists. He needed to be sure of himself. Where did he stand in all of this? He knew he was a skilled fighter. He had trained under some of the finest masters in the Fire Nation, and his raw determination had always pushed him forward. But that wasn't enough. He needed to understand firebending, not just as a weapon, but as a force of nature. And beyond that, he needed to be more than just a bender. He needed to think. To plan. To be a step ahead of every enemy he encountered. Because if he played this right, he wouldn't just return home. He would change everything. Zuko's gaze drifted toward the center of the ship, where his uncle sat at a wooden table, speaking with one of the soldiers. Wisps of steam curled from the porcelain teapot before him, the scent of jasmine tea mixing with the crisp ocean air. For a moment, Zuko simply observed him. His uncle, General Iroh, the Dragon of the West. Arguably the greatest firebender alive. That title had never carried much weight to him before. But now that he truly understood the forces at play in this world, it was staggering to think about. This man, with his round belly and relaxed smile, had once laid siege to Ba Sing Se, the greatest city on the planet. He had fought some of the strongest warriors in the world, and he had walked away victorious more times than not. And yet, he sat here, drinking tea as if none of it mattered. Zuko approached, his boots clanking softly against the ship's metal deck. Iroh noticed him immediately, finishing his conversation with the soldier before turning his full attention toward him. "Ah, nephew. Come, sit. The morning is cold, but nothing warms the soul like a fine cup of. What is the secret to firebending mastery?" Iroh blinked, his hand pausing over his cup. "That is quite the question to start the morning, Zuko." Zuko sat across from him, unwavering. "I need to know. My training since we left the Fire Nation has made me stronger, but I don't understand why there's such a gap. My father and you, even Azula. What makes you all so much more powerful?" Iroh hummed thoughtfully, setting his teacup down. "Ah, so this is what troubles you." He studied Zuko for a moment before stroking his beard. "Tell me, what do you think is the source of firebending?" "Emotion," Zuko answered automatically. "Passion. Anger. Determination." Iroh smiled slightly. "That is what most firebenders believe, yes. And it is true, to a degree. But firebending is not just the release of emotions. It is the breath of life itself." Zuko furrowed his brow. "The breath of life?" Iroh gestured toward the tea. "Fire is unique among the elements. It is not drawn from the world around us like water, earth, or air. It comes from within." He took a slow breath, exhaling softly. A firebender must be in control of their own inner fire. Their breath. Their energy. That is why true mastery does not come from rage or hatred. It comes from balance. Zuko frowned. "Then why is my father so much stronger than me?" Iroh sighed, his expression softening. "Your father is strong, yes. But strength does not always mean understanding." Zuko exhaled sharply. "That doesn't answer my question." Iroh chuckled. "You are persistent, just like your mother." He took a sip of tea before continuing. "Your father has power, Zuko. But power alone does not make a great firebender. And as for your sister..." Zuko's jaw tightened. "Is it just natural talent?" Iroh shook his head. "Azula was gifted, yes. But her true strength comes from something else. Do you know what that is?" Zuko thought for a moment. What made Azula different? What gave her that sharp, terrifying precision? Then, it clicked. She doesn't hesitate. Iroh nodded. Exactly. She bends with complete confidence. There is no doubt in her movements, no uncertainty in her flames. That is why her fire burns so hot. Why it burns blue. Zuko clenched his fists. Confidence. Was that all he lacked? Iroh leaned forward slightly. But confidence alone is not enough. To be a true master, Zuko, you must understand the deeper nature of firebending. Have you ever wondered why our ancestors called it firebending and not fire-wielding? Zuko hesitated. I never thought about it. Iroh smiled. Because fire is not a weapon, my nephew. It is an art. A dance. A force that must be guided, not forced. Tell me, do you know the original firebenders? The dragons. Correct. And what do you know of them? Zuko's memories supplied him with images from the show. the last dragons, ran and Shaw. The dragon dance. He hadn't understood it as a kid, but now. They didn't just breathe fire, he said slowly. They moved with it. Iroh beamed. Ah! You are beginning to see. He set his teacup down and spread his hands. Waterbenders flow like the tides. Earthbenders stand unshaken, like mountains. Airbenders glide with the wind. And firebenders. We must dance with the flames. Zuko sat back, absorbing his words. Firebending wasn't about force. It wasn't about raw strength or anger. It was about understanding. About movement. About control. Iroh smiled warmly. There is much for you to learn, my nephew. But you are asking the right questions. That is the first step. Zuko nodded, his mind racing. This changed everything. Chapter 4, First Time Firebending. Zuko exhaled slowly, his golden eyes fixed on his uncle. I want to test this. Iroh's lips curled into a knowing smile. Then we shall test it. With that, the two descended from the upper deck, stepping onto the ship's open training area. The cold sea wind howled across the metal floor, but Zuko barely noticed. His mind was focused. He walked a few paces forward, placing distance between himself and Iroh, then turned to face the older man. Begin whenever you are ready, Iroh said gently, his arms folded behind his back. Zuko nodded, closing his eyes. He concentrated. His mind sank into the memories of the prince, the hours of training, the burns, the scoldings from his father, the drills that had been hammered into his body since childhood. He recalled the endless punches and kicks, the rigid stances, the demand for power above all else. But he had more than just the prince's memories. He had knowledge from beyond this world. From the show. From the legend of Korra. The movements of the Sun Warriors. The fluidity of the dragons. The explosive precision of true masters like Iroh, Ozai, and Azula. The grace of airbending woven into firebending, as seen in the descendants of the air nomads. Dance with the flames. The words became a mantra in his mind. Dance with the flames. He opened his eyes. A breath in. His chest expanded, drawing heat into his core. A breath out. Fire surged from his hands. He moved. His body flowed, no longer bound by the rigid, militaristic forms of his past training. His feet glided across the metal deck, his arms weaving through the air as flames erupted in mesmerizing arcs. Each motion was precise, deliberate, his fire not just an attack, but an extension of himself. A spin, and a crescent of flame followed. A step forward, and a sharp jab sent a controlled burst of fire straight ahead. He pivoted, twisting his upper body, and a ribbon of fire coiled around him before dissipating into embers. His flames flickered from deep reds and oranges to white-hot intensity, burning with a beauty and fury that seemed almost alive. The fire did not fight him. It did not resist. It flowed with him, as if it had been waiting for him to understand. Dance with the flames. Zuko lost himself in the movement, in the rhythm of it. His mind, body, and fire were no longer separate things. They were one. A final deep breath. He planted his foot firmly on the deck, twisting his hips, and unleashed a sweeping wave of fire that surged forward before dissipating harmlessly into the air. Silence. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths. His skin was warm, his muscles loose, but not strained. And then, he turned to his uncle. Iroh stood there, staring at him, not with surprise, but with reverence. His eyes shone with something that Zuko could only describe as awe and pride. For the longest time, Iroh said nothing. Then, a wide, genuine smile spread across his face. Well, my nephew, he murmured, stroking his beard. It seems you have taken your first step toward true mastery. Zuko exhaled, steam rising from his breath in the frigid air. He turned to his uncle, his golden eyes gleaming with satisfaction. That felt different. Iroh nodded, still stroking his beard in contemplation. Different how, my nephew? Zuko thought for a moment, searching for the right words. Before, I always felt like I was forcing the fire out. Like I had to push it, control it with sheer willpower. But this time, it was natural. It flowed through me, not against me. He clenched his fists, still feeling the warmth lingering beneath his skin. It felt like freedom. Iroh chuckled, his round belly shaking slightly. Ah, now that is wisdom, Prince Zuko. Fire is not meant to be forced. It is a living energy, a gift. And like all gifts, it must be accepted before it can be truly wielded. Zuko turned back toward the open deck, the cold wind whipping against his sweat-slicked skin. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers. Fire is life, he murmured, recalling the wisdom of the Sun Warriors from the show. Then what does that make me? His uncle's voice pulled him from his thoughts. What inspired you to move like that? Zuko hesitated, debating what to say. He couldn't exactly tell Iroh he had knowledge of this world's future, that he had seen the greatest firebenders in history. He settled on a half-truth. I was thinking about fire differently. Not as a tool, not as a weapon, but as part of me. It isn't something I summon, it's something I am. Iroh's smile deepened. Now you are beginning to understand. Zuko's gaze drifted past his uncle to the vast, icy sea. He caught sight of a rogue iceberg drifting aimlessly in the water, jagged and massive, a towering monument of frozen time. An idea formed in his mind. He turned back to Iroh. I want to test this, as an attack. Iroh raised an eyebrow. Attack? Zuko nodded toward the iceberg. That. Iroh followed his gaze, then chuckled. Very well, my nephew. Show me. Zuko strode toward the railing, gripping the cold metal as he stared at his target. The iceberg was large, at least the size of their ship's lower deck, with jagged edges and cracks running through it. A perfect test subject. He inhaled deeply, closing his eyes once more. He focused, not on rage or aggression, no, that was the old Zuko's way. Instead, he let the fire breathe. He let it grow. The heat of the sun bathed him, feeding the fire within. He could feel it, the warmth soaking into his skin, flowing through his veins. His body wasn't just a conduit for fire, it was fire. He spread his stance, grounding himself. His arms moved slowly at first, hands tracing the air with the grace of a dancer. A faint glow shimmered around his fingertips, flickering embers forming in his palms. Dance with the flames. His movements grew sharper, more deliberate. He spun on his heel, his right arm sweeping forward as his left hand pulled back. Fire ignited, swirling around his arms in a spiral of controlled destruction. The warmth in his core surged upward, his breath fueling the inferno. His heartbeat steadied. One breath. One strike. Zuko's eyes snapped open. He thrust his hands forward. A roar erupted from his palms, a massive, concentrated blast of fire, hotter than anything he had ever produced before. It surged across the open sea, a blinding spear of golden-orange destruction. The moment it touched the iceberg, the world exploded. The ice didn't just crack. It shattered. A deafening boom echoed across the water as steam erupted into the sky. Chunks of ice rocketed in all directions, sizzling as they struck the ocean. The sheer force of the blast sent ripples through the water, rocking the ship ever so slightly. And when the steam cleared, nothing remained but the churning sea. The iceberg was gone. Zuko lowered his hands, breathing hard. He stared at the destruction, his mind racing. He had never produced firepower like that before, not even close. Behind him, Iroh let out a low whistle. Ho ho, now that was impressive. Zuko turned, expecting amusement or even concern in his uncle's expression. But what he saw instead was something else. Pride. Genuine, unfiltered pride. Iroh stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on his nephew's shoulder. You are beginning to understand, Zuko. Fire is not simply about anger. It is passion. It is strength. It is life. Zuko looked at his hands again, his fingers still tingling from the raw power he had unleashed. He knew then, this was only the beginning. He had been given a second chance. And he would make sure he earned it. Zuko exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers as the last traces of heat dissipated from his skin. He had just unleashed an attack of devastating power, one far beyond anything the original Zuko had ever done at this point in time. Yet, he didn't feel drained. Not even the slightest bit fatigued. That wasn't normal. His brow furrowed as his mind raced. Firebenders generated fire from their own energy, chi, unlike waterbenders who relied on an external source, or earthbenders who needed solid ground. Firebenders created their element. Their ability was directly tied to their life force, their stamina. The more chi a firebender possessed, the more fire they could bend. And yet, despite expelling such an intense blast, he felt fine. He scoured his inherited memories, everything Zuko had known about chi, firebending, and his own limitations. He was certain of one thing: even a week ago, Zuko could never have done something like this. He had always struggled with power, barely able to keep up with Azula or even his own soldiers. But now he had tapped into something different. Perhaps there was a reason he had been brought into this world. Perhaps he wasn't just some cosmic mistake, a random soul thrown into the Fire Nation prince's body. Maybe, just maybe, he had a purpose here. Just then, a thunderous explosion shattered the stillness of the evening. The entire ship shook from the force of the blast, the deck vibrating beneath his feet. Zuko instinctively turned, his sharp golden eyes scanning the distant horizon. At first, there was nothing but snow clouds, but then he saw it. A flare. It burned in the distance, illuminating the sky for mere moments before fading into the vast, icy sky. And just like that, he knew. His heart pounded, excitement surging through him. That explosion, it wasn't natural. It wasn't just another iceberg cracking under the pressure of the sea. No, he recognized it immediately. Aang was awake. That was the explosion caused by him and Katara triggering the old Fire Nation ship's booby trap. His lips curled into a small smirk. So it begins. He turned back toward the sea, watching as the waves settled from the aftershock of his own attack. The world was shifting, the tides of destiny moving in their course. He straightened his posture, clenching his fist. "See you soon, Avatar." And with that, the flames vanished, and the hunt truly began. Chapter 5, The Avatar. The morning sun hung low in the sky, still trying to push through the heavy mist that clung to the vast, icy sea. A crisp breeze cut across the deck of the metal ship. The ship groaned as it swayed gently in the waters, its metal frame creaking under the pressure of the elements. Zuko stood on the bow, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the flare had erupted in a sudden, violent burst of light. His golden eyes narrowed, the calmness of the sea no longer offering any comfort. "Uncle," Zuko said, his voice sharp, "we need to go to where the flare came from. Now." Iroh, having returned to his table just a short distance away, had been quietly sipping his tea. He looked up from his cup with a furrowed brow, his face betraying a sense of disbelief. "Zuko, it's probably just an animal or some old Fire Nation ship's traps triggered by the wind. We don't need to waste time chasing every flare on this cold sea." Zuko shook his head, his body tense with urgency. "No, Uncle, this is different. Please, trust me. We have to check it out." Iroh hesitated for a moment, his eyes studying Zuko's face. The prince was no longer the brash, hot-headed youth who had stormed out in search of glory. There was something else now, an edge of resolve that hadn't been there before. Something in Zuko's voice made Iroh reconsider, and he sighed, his large frame slowly rising from his seat. "If you're certain, then we'll follow your lead," Iroh said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of an experienced advisor. "But if this turns out to be a wild goose chase, don't be disappointed if we find nothing but more icebergs." He turned to the crew, calling over his shoulder. The crew scrambled to respond. Zuko could hear their hurried footsteps on the metal deck as Iroh conveyed the orders, his voice loud and commanding. "Change course. Set off to the direction of the flare." Zuko turned his gaze back to the horizon, the light of the flare still etched in his mind. There had been no sign of ships, no indication of any larger presence, yet he was certain this wasn't just a random flare. It had to be Aang and Katara. It was the only thing that made any sense to him. His thoughts raced as the ship's crew worked quickly to change direction. The clanking of metal, the roar of the engines adjusting, and the orders shouted from below decks faded into the background as Zuko stood at the bow, staring across the cold expanse of water. His uncle came up behind him and stood beside him, looking over the rail as the ship began to turn slowly, its massive frame groaning against the water. "You're quite determined to find the source of that flare," Iroh remarked thoughtfully, his voice low. "Do you have a feeling about this?" Zuko's eyes narrowed, his mind processing all the possible outcomes. He wasn't sure exactly what he was expecting, but the flare was unmistakable. It wasn't just an accident, it was a message. A message that the world was about to change, and he needed to be ready. "I don't know, Uncle," Zuko replied, his voice distant. "But if this is somehow tied to the Avatar, if we can find him before the Fire Nation does," he didn't finish the thought. His heart raced with anticipation, and for the first time in a long while, Zuko felt like he was on the edge of something bigger than himself. Iroh's eyes softened as he studied his nephew. He placed a hand on Zuko's shoulder, his smile faint but genuine. "You've grown, Zuko. You are starting to think beyond the mission. And that is what will guide you to your true destiny." Zuko nodded, grateful for his uncle's words, but the weight of the task ahead pressed heavily on his mind. He knew the risks, he couldn't afford to make a mistake, not now. As the ship veered closer to the area where the flare had exploded, Zuko stayed vigilant, his gaze fixed ahead. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't flinch. This was only the beginning, and he had to be prepared for whatever lay ahead. The ship continued to move steadily, cutting through the ice-laden sea as the morning sun broke through the clouds above. Zuko felt the first stirrings of unease deep within his chest, but he squashed them down, focusing instead on the mission. The flare was only a signal that the world was starting to shift, and the Avatar was awakening from his century-long slumber. Soon, very soon, Zuko would have his chance to encounter the boy who would either change the world or destroy it. And he would be ready. The ship's course adjusted further, the deck now angled toward the far-off horizon where the flare had once illuminated the sky. As the morning stretched on, Zuko could feel the air growing colder, the sea stretching endlessly around them. They were getting closer. The cold sea rumbled as the massive Fire Nation warship tore through the ice. The ship's powerful icebreaker bow shattered the frozen ocean, pushing jagged chunks aside as it advanced like a great metal beast. The deep grinding of ice against steel echoed across the barren tundra, sending a chill through the small, isolated southern water tribe village. On the ship's main deck, Zuko stood with his arms behind his back, watching the last stronghold of the southern water tribe come into view. His golden eyes scanned the ragged, makeshift walls of ice and snow, unimpressed by their pathetic defense. He wondered how he was going to play this. He needed to find a balance between being a threat so that Aang would come with him willingly but not so much a threat that Uncle Iroh would be suspicious of the sudden change in his personality. He wasn't a fighter back on Earth. He was more of a lover, but here, in this world, he had to play the part of the prince. His goal of returning to the Fire Nation fit in well with the original goal of the prince, but his real ambition was now just to do whatever the fuck he wanted to do. That included having power. He wanted power so that he wouldn't have to feel what he felt on that day. That helplessness and worthlessness. The death that came of it almost seemed like a welcome relief for him. He didn't want to feel like that again. He would do whatever it took to not feel those feelings again. A single warrior, a boy barely older than 15, stood at the ready, gripping a spear with both hands as if his flimsy resolve alone could protect the village. The ship lurched to a halt as the icebreaker crushed through the final layers of frozen sea. A massive cloud of steam erupted from the ship's bow, hissing like an angry dragon. With a heavy clang, the metal ramp of the warship lowered, slamming against the ice with a deep, echoing thud. A formation of 12 Fire Nation soldiers marched out first, splitting into 2 precise lines. They moved with discipline and authority, their heavy boots thudding against the frozen ground as they formed an imposing corridor of steel and flame. Then came Zuko. He walked with deliberate confidence, the soldiers standing at rigid attention as he passed between them. Behind him, Iroh followed at a slower pace, his expression unreadable. He stopped at the base of the ramp, standing just outside the village. He let his gaze linger over the crowd of terrified villagers, women, children, and the elderly. None of them could fight. None of them could stop him. A smirk curled on his lips. "My name is Zuko, firstborn son of the Fire Lord and heir to the throne," he began. "I come here looking for a certain someone that doesn't belong here." A stranger who emerged from the ice. "Where is the Avatar?" he demanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the wind like a blade. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to say. Zuko narrowed his eyes, scanning the villagers for the image he had of the young Avatar in his mind. The warrior boy, Sokka, suddenly rushed forward with his spear, yelling a war cry. Pathetic. Zuko, using the memories of the prince as a guide and muscle memory, sidestepped effortlessly, gripping the spear just below the tip. With a single twist, the wooden shaft snapped in half like a brittle twig. Before Sokka could react, Zuko slammed a boot into his chest, sending him sprawling backward into the snow. The villagers gasped in horror. "I admire your spirit," Zuko said mockingly as he stepped forward, towering over Sokka. "But your skills are as weak as your people." He played to the part. Sokka gritted his teeth and grabbed his boomerang, launching it toward Zuko's head. Without even turning, Zuko tilted his head slightly, the weapon whizzed past his face, missing by mere inches. With a snap of his fingers, a small fireball ignited in his palm. "I should burn that toy to ashes." Sokka's defiant expression faltered. Zuko smirked, even to his surprise, enjoying the look of powerlessness on the boy's face. He could kill him now and send a message to the entire tribe. That would make them fear him, and fear was far stronger than mercy, but it wasn't him. That would be going too far, and Aang wasn't even here yet. That was not his goal. But then, a gust of wind blew through the village. A shadow passed overhead. Zuko's smirk faded as he turned his gaze skyward. Descending from the sky atop a massive, six-legged flying bison was a young boy, his head completely shaven save for the blue arrow tattoos on his scalp. Aang. The Avatar. Zuko's fingers curled into a fist, extinguishing the fireball in his palm. Aang landed smoothly on the snow, his expression a mix of anger and caution. Beside him, a girl with long brown hair, dressed in thick blue robes, stood with a furious glare. Katara. Zuko found himself studying her a little too long. He couldn't believe just how beautiful she looked in person. Even as a grown man, he saw her as the beauty she truly was. He wasn't an adult anymore. Going after her would not be a crime in this world. Even hidden beneath the heavy clothing of the Water Tribe, her figure was. Not the time, he scolded himself. Aang stepped protectively in front of Sokka. His voice was firm, resolute. "Leave them alone." Zuko raised an eyebrow. He knew how this would play out. "You're the Avatar," he said, his voice cool and measured. "You are the only one I want." Aang didn't move. His eyes flicked to the terrified villagers. His lips curled into a smirk. "You can come with me willingly," he said, gesturing to the warship behind him. "Or I can burn this village to the ground." The moment he said it, he felt Iroh's sharp gaze on him. In the show, Zuko never threatened the village outright. But this was not that Zuko. Aang's expression twisted with anger. He glanced at Katara. Then at the villagers. Zuko could see the hesitation. This is the moment. He didn't need to physically harm anyone. The threat alone was enough. After a tense silence, Aang sighed and dropped his staff. "Fine," Aang said. I'll go with you. The village collectively gasped. Zuko felt a wave of satisfaction. The Avatar had just handed himself over without a fight. He had broken Aang's resolve without even lifting a finger. He turned sharply on his heel. Take him to the ship. Two Fire Nation soldiers immediately stepped forward and grabbed Aang's arms. The young Avatar didn't resist. As Zuko walked back toward the ship, he caught one last glimpse of Katara's furious expression. Oh, he was going to enjoy breaking her spirit. Chapter 6: The Rescue. The Fire Nation soldiers cuffed the young Avatar on Zuko's orders. Set a course for the Fire Nation. Zuko barked as they returned aboard the ship. Aang, why are you doing this? Katara's voice echoed across the frozen landscape, filled with desperation. Everything will be fine, Katara. Just take care of Appa for me. Aang called back, his voice tinged with forced optimism. As the black ship closed its ramp, the villagers felt a mix of relief and guilt. No one felt this more acutely than Sokka, the self-proclaimed warrior of the Southern Water Tribe. He watched the ship depart with a heavy heart, his mind racing with thoughts of the boy who had just saved his village. Avatar Aang, huh? Sokka muttered to himself. I guess I can't let you die on my behalf, kid. Katara stormed across the icy shore, her fists clenched at her sides. How could you just let him go, Sokka? She shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. Aang saved us. He saved all of us. And you just stood there and did nothing. Sokka, kneeling by a small canoe he had been preparing, didn't look up at first. He tightened a knot on the rope securing their supplies, his face unreadable. Katara, I didn't let him go. Zuko had an entire warship and a squad of soldiers. What was I supposed to do? Charge in and get myself captured too? Katara stopped in her tracks, her eyes blazing. You could have done something. Instead of just standing there like a... Like a what? Sokka finally stood, turning to face her. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Like a coward? Is that what you were going to say? Katara opened her mouth to retort but hesitated. She hadn't meant to go that far, but the words had already spilled out. She crossed her arms, looking away. I can't believe you didn't even try. Sokka sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, Katara, I get it. You're upset. I'm upset too. But yelling at me isn't going to help Aang. So, do you want to keep yelling, or do you want to actually do something about it? Katara blinked, caught off guard. What are you talking about? Sokka gestured to the canoe behind him. I've been getting this ready while you were busy lecturing me. If we're going to rescue Aang, we need to move fast. Zuko's ship has a head start, but if we push hard, we might be able to catch up. Katara stared at him, her anger melting into surprise. You were planning to go after him? Of course I was, Sokka said, rolling his eyes. Did you really think I'd just let that Prince Zuko guy take him? I'm not heartless, Katara. I just don't see the point in charging him without a plan. Before Katara could respond, a voice interrupted them. And where do you two think you're going? They turned to see Gran standing a few feet away, her arms crossed and her expression stern. Katara and Sokka exchanged nervous glances, bracing themselves for a lecture. Katara began, but Gran cut her off. You'll need these, she said, tossing a large bag onto the snow between them. It landed with a soft thud, and Katara quickly knelt to open it. Inside were supplies, dried meat, blankets, and even a few changes of clothes. Katara looked up, her eyes wide. Gran. The old woman's stern expression softened, and she gave them a small smile. Aang is the Avatar, and you two have found him. Your destinies are no longer here in this village. They're out there, with him. Sokka groaned, rubbing the back of his neck. Catching up to a warship in a canoe is going to be impossible, Gran. We'll never make it in time. Katara's eyes lit up as an idea struck her. What if we don't use the canoe, she said, turning to point at the sea. What if we use him? Sokka followed her gaze and groaned even louder. Appa, Aang's massive flying bison, was lazily floating in the cold water, his tail swishing back and forth as if he didn't have a care in the world. You can't be serious, Sokka said, throwing his hands up. We're supposed to ride that thing? Do you even know how to steer it? Katara shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. How hard can it be? Aang made it look easy. Gran stepped forward, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. Listen to me, both of you. This journey will not be easy, but it is necessary. The world needs the Avatar, and the Avatar needs you. Stay strong, stay together, and remember who you are. She pulled them into a tight embrace, her arms warm despite the cold. Katara and Sokka hugged her back, their earlier tension fading as they realized the weight of what they were about to do. When Gran finally released them, she stepped back, her eyes glistening with pride. Now go. And don't look back. Katara and Sokka exchanged a determined glance before turning to Appa. The bison let out a low groan as they approached, but he didn't resist as they climbed onto his back. Yip yip. Katara tried, mimicking Aang's command. Appa's ears perked up, and with a powerful thrust of his tail, he lifted off the water and into the sky. Sokka let out a yelp, clinging to the saddle as they soared higher. Okay, this is officially the craziest thing we've ever done, Sokka shouted over the wind. Katara laughed, the sound carrying a mix of excitement and relief. Just wait, Sokka. This is only the beginning. As they flew off into the horizon, Gran watched them go, her smile fading into a look of quiet resolve. She whispered a silent prayer to the spirits, asking for their protection, before turning back to the village. The sky was lit, the sun partly hidden behind thick clouds as Appa descended silently toward Zuko's massive metal warship. Katara and Sokka crouched low on the bison's back, their eyes scanning the deck for any signs of movement. To their surprise, there were no lookouts posted, no soldiers patrolling the upper decks. The ship seemed eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of its engines and the occasional clang of metal echoing from below. Where is everyone? Katara whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Sokka frowned, his hand tightening around the hilt of his boomerang. Maybe they're all below deck. Zuko's ship runs on coal, so they probably have most of the crew working in the engine room or something. Katara nodded, her eyes narrowing as she studied the ship. We need to get down there. If Aang's on this ship, he's probably being held on the lowest level. That way, even if he escapes, he'd have to fight his way through the entire crew. Sokka groaned softly. Great! So we're just going to waltz into the belly of a Fire Nation warship? What could possibly go wrong? Katara shot him a look. Do you have a better idea? Sokka opened his mouth to retort but quickly closed it. Fine. But if we get caught, I'm blaming you. With a quiet command, Katara guided Appa to land on a secluded part of the ship's deck, near the stern. The bison's massive paws touched down with barely a sound, and Katara and Sokka quickly dismounted, their movements careful and deliberate. Stay here, Appa, Katara whispered, patting the bison's side. We'll be back soon. Appa let out a low groan in response, his eyes watching them with what almost seemed like concern. The siblings moved quickly but quietly, their footsteps muffled by the soft soles of their boots. They found a hatch leading below deck and carefully pried it open, revealing a dimly lit corridor. The air was thick with the smell of coal and oil, and the distant clatter of machinery echoed through the metal walls. Stay close, Sokka whispered, leading the way. And keep your eyes open. If we run into anyone, we're toast. Katara nodded, her heart pounding as they descended into the ship's lower levels. The corridors were narrow and maze-like, with pipes and vents running along the walls. Every creak and groan of the ship's metal frame made them freeze, their ears straining for any sign of approaching soldiers. As they crept deeper into the ship, they heard voices, angry, raised voices. Katara grabbed Sokka's arm, pulling him into the shadow of a large pipe just as two soldiers rounded the corner. The men were arguing about something, their voices loud and careless as they passed by without noticing the intruders. "That was close," Sokka muttered once the soldiers were out of earshot. Katara nodded, her eyes wide. "Let's keep moving." They continued down the corridor, following the sound of the voices. As they rounded another corner, they found themselves near an open doorway. Inside, they could see Zuko pacing back and forth, his face twisted in frustration. Across from him stood Iroh, his expression calm but firm. "You don't understand, Uncle." Zuko snapped, his voice sharp and impatient. "The Avatar is more than just a prisoner. He's the key to everything. If I can bring him to my father, I'll finally prove myself. I'll finally be worthy of the throne." Iroh sighed, his hands clasped behind his back. "Zuko, you must think carefully about what you're doing. The Avatar is not just a prize to be won. He is a person, a child. And he carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. Do not let your ambition blind you to the consequences of your actions." Zuko stopped pacing, his golden eyes blazing. "Consequences? What consequences?" "The Fire Nation will rule the world, Uncle. And I will be the one to make it happen." Iroh's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "Power without wisdom is a dangerous thing, Zuko. Do not lose yourself in your pursuit of it." Zuko turned away, his fists clenched at his sides. "I don't need your lectures, Uncle. I know what I'm doing." Katara and Sokka exchanged a glance, their eyes wide. Katara leaned closer to Sokka, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to follow him. If he's going to see Aang, he might lead us right to him." Sokka nodded, though he looked less than thrilled. "Great! Just what I wanted to do, follow the angry Fire Nation prince through a ship full of soldiers. What could possibly go wrong?" As Zuko stormed out of the room, Katara and Sokka slipped out of their hiding spot and followed at a safe distance. Zuko moved quickly, his footsteps echoing through the metal corridors. The siblings stayed close to the walls, using the shadows and the ship's machinery to stay hidden. At one point, Zuko stopped abruptly, causing Katara and Sokka to freeze in their tracks. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as if he sensed something. Katara held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. After a tense moment, Zuko shook his head and continued walking. "That was too close," Sokka whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Keep moving," Katara urged, her eyes never leaving Zuko's back. They followed him down another set of stairs, deeper into the ship's lower levels. The air grew hotter and heavier, the sound of machinery growing louder. They passed by several soldiers, but Zuko's presence seemed to deter anyone from questioning why he was there. Katara and Sokka used this to their advantage, staying just far enough behind to avoid detection. Finally, Zuko stopped in front of a heavy metal door. He glanced around briefly before unlocking it and stepping inside. Katara and Sokka waited a moment before creeping closer, peering through the crack in the door. Inside, they saw Aang, sitting on a chair behind a table with his hands bound. Zuko stood over him, his expression unreadable. As Katara and Sokka watched, a sudden noise behind them made them both jump. They turned to see a soldier approaching, his eyes narrowing as he spotted them. "Hey! What are you two doing down here?" the soldier demanded, his hand reaching for the weapon at his side. Sokka reacted quickly, grabbing a loose pipe from the wall and swinging it at the soldier's head. The man crumpled to the ground with a soft groan. "Nice one," Katara whispered, though her voice was shaky. "Let's get Aang and get out of here," Sokka said, his eyes darting back to the door. Katara nodded, her resolve hardening. "Ready?" Sokka took a deep breath. "Ready." Katara and Sokka exchanged a quick nod, their hearts pounding as they prepared to burst into the room. Sokka gripped his boomerang tightly, while Katara's hands hovered at her sides, ready to bend water at a moment's notice. They didn't have time to think, they had to act. "On 3, Sokka whispered, his voice barely audible. 1, 2, 3. With a forceful kick, Sokka slammed the door open, and the two of them rushed inside, their eyes scanning the room for Zuko. Katara's hand shot up, a stream of water forming from the pouch at her side, while Sokka raised his boomerang, ready to strike. But the room was mostly empty, or so it seemed. Aang sat alone at a small table in the center of the room, his hands resting calmly in front of him. He looked up at them with a sheepish grin, his eyes wide with surprise. "Just in time, huh, guys?" Aang said, his voice light but tinged with nervousness. Katara and Sokka froze, their weapons still raised as they looked around the room. There was no sign of Zuko, no soldiers, no traps. Just Aang, sitting there as if he'd been waiting for them. "Where's Zuko?" Sokka demanded, his eyes darting around the room. "What's going on, Aang?" Before Aang could answer, the door behind them slammed shut with a loud clang. Katara and Sokka spun around, their weapons at the ready, but there was no one there. The door had closed on its own, or so it seemed. Then, a voice echoed through the room, cold and deliberate. "Like I told you, Aang," Zuko said, his voice coming from somewhere above them. "Your friends would be coming." Katara and Sokka looked up to see Zuko standing on a metal walkway that ran along the upper part of the room. He leaned casually against the railing, his golden eyes glinting in the dim light. His arms were crossed, and a faint smirk played on his lips. "Now then," Zuko said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "I think it's about time we got to talking." Chapter 7, Fire and Ice. Sokka lunged forward, gripping the handle of his weapon, the club-like jaw blade he kept strapped to his side. His body moved instinctively, driven by the rush of adrenaline surging through his veins. With a fierce war cry, he swung the weapon straight for Zuko's head. Zuko, ever the trained warrior, reacted in a blink. He shifted his stance, smoothly sidestepping Sokka's wild attack. His golden eyes gleamed with sharp focus as he caught Sokka's wrist in a firm grip, halting his momentum entirely. Before Sokka could react, Zuko twisted his arm and yanked him forward with a sharp tug. The force sent Sokka stumbling off balance. With a precise movement, Zuko turned his body and shoved Sokka backward, sending him crashing into the nearby metal table. Sokka grunted as his back slammed against the cold steel. The impact sent a stack of scrolls tumbling to the floor, and his weapon clattered uselessly out of his hand. His teeth clenched in frustration. He had charged in without thinking, and Zuko had overpowered him with ease. Katara, seeing her brother thrown aside, raised her arms and pulled from the nearest source of water, her small, leather water skin. She felt the familiar chill against her palms as the liquid rushed to her command. Her heart pounded. She had never used her bending in an actual battle before, but she had to do something. "Leave him alone," she shouted, thrusting her arms forward. A thin stream of water shot out, aiming for Zuko's chest. But her inexperience betrayed her. The attack was slow, predictable. Zuko easily stepped aside, avoiding the stream entirely. Katara gasped as she realized too late that her control over the water had faltered. Her bending wobbled and veered off course. Before she could correct it, the water arced and splashed down, right onto Aang and Sokka's chained hands. And then it froze. The temperature in the room was already cool from the ocean wind seeping through the ship, and the sudden loss of control caused Katara's water to solidify on impact. A thick layer of ice locked Aang and Sokka's hands together, the chains beneath them now completely encased. Aang blinked, looking down at their fused hands. Was that supposed to happen?" Sokka groaned in frustration. "Oh, great. Just what I needed, an ice-cold handcuff." Before Katara could even think of an apology, a deafening roar shook the room. "Enough!" Zuko's voice thundered through the chamber, and with it came a wave of scorching heat. A burst of fire erupted from his mouth, a flurry of flames that fanned out and cast long, flickering shadows against the walls. The very air in the room became stiflingly hot, and Katara instinctively flinched back. The flames dissipated just as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind only the sensation of smoldering embers. Zuko stood at the center of it all, his breath heavy, his stance firm. You three are my prisoners now, he declared, his voice laced with unwavering authority. And you're not escaping from me anytime soon. Katara's fists clenched as she glared at him. Aang remained quiet, his expression unreadable. Sokka, despite the situation, simply huffed in annoyance as he continued tugging at his frozen hands. Zuko took a step closer, his expression darkening. Get ready, Aang, Sokka, and Katara, he said, emphasizing their names. I have plans for you three. With that, he turned on his heel and strode toward the door. He didn't bother looking back as he slammed it shut behind him, locking them inside the dimly lit chamber. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Katara spoke, her voice uncertain. How did he know our names? Sokka, still struggling to pry his frozen hands free, echoed her concern. Yeah, and how did he know we were coming? Aang, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, finally let out an exaggerated sigh. Gee, thanks for the rescue, guys. Sokka turned his head sharply. Hey! Sarcasm is my thing, he whined. He tugged harder against the ice but only succeeded in making his fingers feel even colder. Ugh, this is your fault, Katara. Katara's patience snapped. Enough, she barked. Stop whining and let me fix it. She reached forward, placing her hands over the frozen link binding Aang and Sokka. She shut her eyes and concentrated, feeling the connection between water and warmth. Slowly, she directed a small amount of heat into the ice, not too much, just enough to weaken it. The ice didn't completely melt, but it turned to slush, loosening just enough for Sokka to wrench his hands free. He let out a relieved sigh and shook out his arms, though he still looked annoyed. Aang, however, remained chained to the table. Okay, Katara said, exhaling deeply. It doesn't matter what happened. The important thing is, we're here now. We need to figure out a plan. Sokka scoffed, rubbing his still-cold hands together. A plan? You do realize we're on the lowest level of a Fire Nation warship, right? And that there are dozens of Fire Nation soldiers between us and the exit? Aang lifted his head. Didn't you guys have a plan when you came? He asked. Sokka threw his hands up. Oh, excuse me, he said sarcastically. Forgive me for rushing to save the one person in the world who can stop the Fire Nation instead of coming up with a perfect, foolproof plan first. Aang crossed his arms. Well, I told you not to worry about me. To take care of Appa for me. Sokka's jaw dropped. The bison? You were captured. You were being hauled onto a Fire Nation warship. Excuse me for thinking that mattered. Aang flinched slightly, but Sokka wasn't finished. You're the Avatar, right? The one who can bend all four elements. The most powerful being on the planet? His voice grew sharper. Well then, why don't you get us out of here? Enough, Sokka, Katara interrupted, her tone firm. Aang had no response. No comeback. Sokka's expression remained hardened. The world has been waiting for you, Aang. 100 years. Do you have any idea how many lives have been lost while you were gone? Thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Millions. His voice grew quieter but no less intense. How many do you think prayed that the Avatar might return and save them? To end this war? He sighed, exhaling a breath filled with frustration, anger, and something deeper. Something heavier. Sokka slid down against the cold metal wall, resting his arms on his knees. I've heard stories about the Avatar my whole life. About how you were supposed to restore balance. End this war. But here we are, and the first thing you do when you're free is worry about a giant flying cow. Aang stared at him, his chest tight. It's not fair to say that, Katara spoke softly. He's just a kid. Sokka didn't even lift his head. The Fire Nation doesn't care, Katara. His voice was flat. How many kids have they killed? How many more grew up as orphans? A beat of silence. All that matters now, Sokka muttered, is him. He lifted his head, looking straight at Aang. And he's not the avatar we expected. With that, he slumped forward, gripping his boomerang tightly in his hands. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging between them. And once again, Aang didn't have a comeback. Outside the chamber, Zuko stood leaning against the cold metal door. His arms were crossed, his posture casual, almost relaxed, but his expression was anything but. His golden eyes flickered with a quiet intensity as he listened to the conversation unfolding within. The muffled voices of his prisoners carried through the steel barrier, the weight of Sokka's words cutting through even the thick metal. The world has been waiting for you, Aang. 100 years. Do you have any idea how many lives have been lost while you were gone? Thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Millions. Zuko's fingers twitched slightly. His breath was slow and measured, but his heart pounded in his chest. How many do you think prayed that the Avatar might return and save them? To end this war? He had never considered it from that perspective before. Even the old Zuko had always been taught that the Avatar was an enemy of the Fire Nation, an obstacle standing between his people and their rightful dominance. But for the rest of the world? The Avatar had been their hope. Their last, desperate chance at salvation. And yet, Sokka was right. This boy, this naive, airheaded monk, was not the Avatar they had all been waiting for. Zuko exhaled sharply, barely realizing he had been holding his breath. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the ship's engines. Sokka is right, Aang. His voice was low, carrying a quiet, almost dangerous certainty. The world doesn't have time for your naivety. He turned away from the door, his boots echoing against the steel floor as he walked down the dimly lit corridor. His hands clenched into fists, determination burning in his veins like fire itself. And I will make sure of it. With that final vow, Zuko disappeared into the shadows of his warship, leaving the three prisoners behind, unaware that the Prince of the Fire Nation had just made his own decision about the fate of the Avatar. Chapter 8, A Prince's Burden. The scent of roasted meat and spiced tea filled the air as the Fire Nation warship rocked gently over the rolling ocean waves. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, its golden rays casting long shadows across the polished metal floors of the ship's dining hall. Zuko sat at the long wooden table, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his teacup. Across from him, his uncle, General Iroh, was already halfway through his meal, noisily chewing on a piece of roasted duck while humming a tune under his breath. For a moment, Zuko simply watched the older man. Iroh. The man who had once been next in line for the throne. A seasoned general who had conquered Ba Sing Se, only to abandon his campaign after the loss of his son. A man who should have been bitter, hardened, resentful, but instead was this, a cheerful, tea-obsessed old warrior with a soft heart. If Zuko had woken up in this world blind to what was coming, he might have trusted the man. But he wasn't blind. He had memories, both his own, and those of the real Zuko, whose body he now inhabited. And if those memories were anything to go by, Iroh was a man who would always stand between him and the Fire Nation throne. Not out of malice. Not out of ambition. But because Iroh did not believe in Zuko to be like his father. At least not in the show. Destiny is a funny thing, isn't it, Prince Zuko? Iroh's voice broke through his thoughts, and Zuko blinked, realizing that his uncle had been watching him for some time now. He cleared his throat, lifting his teacup and taking a slow sip, more to buy himself time than anything else. What do you mean? He asked. Iroh took another bite of his duck before setting it down, licking the grease from his fingers. I mean that you have done something truly remarkable, my dear nephew. You have captured the Avatar. Zuko said nothing, staring down at his tea. And yet, Iroh continued, his tone turning playful, you do not look like a man who has accomplished something great. Zuko let out a slow breath. It's complicated. Iroh chuckled. Ah, yes. Complicated. That seems to be a recurring theme in your life, does it not? Zuko frowned. He wasn't sure if that was meant to be a joke or a subtle jab. With Iroh, it was always hard to tell. What do you plan to do with them? Iroh asked, his voice now carrying a more serious weight. With the Avatar and his friends? Zuko exhaled, setting down his cup. I intend to bring the Avatar back to the Fire Nation, he said simply. With the Avatar in my custody, my father will have no choice but to welcome me back. He will see my worth. Iroh hummed, swirling his tea in his cup. And what of the other two? Zuko hesitated for half a second. Katara and Sokka. They were important to Aang. That much was clear, and he knew as much from the show. And the old Zuko, the one who had once been so consumed by his obsession, would have seen them as nothing more than obstacles. But he was not that Zuko. He was something else. Someone else. They were just kids. No. That wasn't right. They were kids, yes, but they were important kids. And importance meant leverage. It meant control. Zuko met his uncle's gaze and gave a measured response. I don't intend to harm them. That would be unwise. Iroh raised an eyebrow. Oh? Zuko leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. They are the Avatar's friends. His support. His family. If I hurt them, he will never trust me. If I make them hate me, he will never see anything beyond the enemy in front of him. And I need more than just his capture. Iroh's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something unreadable. You want to control him. I want to shape him, Zuko corrected. Right now, he is soft. He is naive. He still believes that he can run from this war and that the world will simply wait for him to be ready. He clenched his fist, an old rage, one that wasn't entirely his own, boiling beneath his skin. But the world won't wait for him. It hasn't waited for him. The Fire Nation doesn't wait for him. He needs to understand that. Iroh studied him for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he let out a long, slow breath. You remind me of your father, he said. Zuko stiffened. I am nothing like him. Iroh sipped his tea, his face calm. Aren't you? Zuko's nails dug into the table. No, he wanted to say. I am not like Ozai. I will never be like him. But hadn't there been a time when he had thought the same about himself? Not Zuko. Himself. The man he had been before he woke up in this world. A man who had once been driven. Ambitious. Hungry for power. A man who had worked his way to the top, sacrificing friendships, relationships, even his own family in the pursuit of success. And in the end, what had it gotten him? Nothing. His job had been stripped from him. His career, his supposed empire, had crumbled in an instant. The people he had pushed away in his endless pursuit of power were gone. And when he had needed them most, he had been alone. Powerless. Just as Zuko had been powerless when Ozai had burned his face. Just as Zuko had been powerless when he had been banished, cast out of his home with nothing but the clothes on his back and the impossible task of capturing the Avatar. But now he had another chance. The Fire Nation throne. The power that came with it. The ability to never be powerless again. And if he had to be the villain in Aang's story to get there? So be it. Zuko took a slow, steady breath and pushed his emotions back down, locking them away where they belonged. I am not my father, he said, his voice firm. Iroh nodded, but there was something in his gaze, something knowing, something sad, that made Zuko want to break something. Very well, Iroh said at last, setting down his empty cup. But I hope, for your sake, that you remember what it is you are fighting for. With that, the older man stood, stretching his arms before making his way toward the door. Zuko sat there, staring at the remnants of his breakfast, watching as the steam from his tea slowly faded into nothing. He would return to the Fire Nation. He would reclaim his honor. He would take back what had been stolen from him. And he would never, never be powerless again. He sat there, his thoughts swirling like the steam rising from his now cold tea. The remnants of his breakfast lay untouched, the roasted meat congealing on the plate. His mind, however, was far from the dining hall of the Fire Nation warship. It was back on Earth, in the life he had left behind, or rather, the life that had left him behind. That day on the subway, as he sat there, staring at the flickering lights of the tunnel, he had wished for death. The purposelessness, the powerlessness, it had been too much to bear. And when the truck in the moment came, he had panicked. He had tried to escape it. He hadn't wanted to die after all. He had been too scared. Maybe that was why the second truck had come. Maybe the universe had decided to grant his wish, whether he was ready or not. But now, here he was, in the body of Prince Zuko, with a second chance. A chance to reclaim what he had lost. A chance to never feel that powerless again. And this time, he would do it differently. He wouldn't push everyone away. He wouldn't sacrifice everything for power. He would be smarter, more calculated. He would use the people around him, but he wouldn't discard them. Not this time. And then there was Azula. His sister. The thought of her sent a shiver down his spine, a mix of fear and desire that he couldn't quite untangle. Back on Earth, when he had watched the show, she had been his favorite character. She was ruthless, cunning, and undeniably powerful. And yes, she was fucking hot. He had fantasized about her more times than he cared to admit, his desire for her overshadowing any moral qualms he might have had. Now, here he was, in the body of her brother. The original Zuko had feared and hated Azula, but those feelings were nothing compared to the desire that burned within him. He wanted her. He wanted to possess her, to dominate her, to make her his in every way possible. And with enough power, he could do it. He could have her, and no one would be able to stop him. The thought sent a thrill through him, a dark, twisted excitement that he couldn't ignore. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he imagined it, Azula, bound and submissive, her fiery spirit broken, her body his to command. It was a fantasy, yes, but one that felt tantalizingly within reach. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. He had a plan, and he needed to stick to it. He would return to the Fire Nation, reclaim his honor, and take back what had been stolen from him. And when he had the power, when he was no longer the banished prince but the Fire Lord, then he would have her. Azula would be his, and no one would dare to stand in his way. Zuko stood, his resolve hardening like steel. He would not be powerless again. He would not be weak. He would take what he wanted, and he would do whatever it took to get it. The Fire Nation throne was just the beginning. Chapter 9, The Dance of Flames. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the vast expanse of the ocean. The Fire Nation warship cut through the waves with a steady rhythm, its metal hull gleaming in the fading light. On the deck, a young man stood surrounded by a dozen Fire Nation soldiers, their expressions stern and focused. This was no ordinary training session, this was a test of skill, control, and mastery. The young man was none other than Zuko, the crown prince of the Fire Nation, his golden eyes sharp with determination as he prepared to face his opponents. A few paces away, seated at a small wooden table, was an elderly man with a round belly and a warm, knowing smile. General Iroh, the Dragon of the West, sipped calmly from a cup of steaming tea, his eyes following the movements of his nephew with a mixture of pride and scrutiny. The scent of jasmine tea mingled with the salty sea air, creating a serene contrast to the tension building on the deck. Iroh raised his hand, a silent signal to begin. In an instant, the dozen soldiers surrounding Zuko sprang into action. Each of them thrust their fists forward, unleashing a barrage of fire attacks that roared through the air like a pack of hungry dragons. The flames converged on Zuko, enveloping him in a swirling vortex of heat and light. For a moment, it seemed as though the young prince would be consumed by the inferno. But Zuko was not so easily defeated. With a swift, fluid motion, he raised his arms, his fingers splayed as if conducting an orchestra. The flames that had been meant to destroy him instead bent to his will, swirling around him in a protective circle. The fire danced at his command, its intensity growing as Zuko channeled his energy into it. The soldiers watched in awe as the flames expanded, their heat radiating across the deck. Then, with a sharp exhale, Zuko thrust his hands outward. The circle of fire split into a dozen fiery tendrils, each one lashing out at the soldiers who had attacked him. The flames struck with precision, sending the men flying backward. They landed hard on the deck, their armor clattering against the metal surface. The air was filled with the sound of groans and the hiss of steam as the flames dissipated. Zuko stood alone amidst the chaos, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. His expression, however, was not one of triumph. Instead, his brow was furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line of dissatisfaction. He had won the battle, but he knew it was far from perfect. From his seat, Iroh observed the scene with a critical eye. He set his teacup down and stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Your breathing was out of tune," he began, his voice calm but firm. "You also used too much movement. It halted your momentum." Zuko turned to his uncle, his golden eyes narrowing as he considered the critique. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Iroh's words. "I tried to increase the size and intensity of the counter," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "But my breathing got out of control, and my movements slowed me down." Iroh nodded, his expression softening. "Charging your attacks requires greater ki control," he explained. "You must first master combining your breathing with your movements. Until you reach a point where it becomes instinctive, you will always struggle against true masters." Zuko clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He knew his uncle was right. "I need more training to do that," he said, his voice resolute. "Right now, I can easily fight against most benders, but to go against the true masters, I need the basics to become second nature, just like you said." Iroh smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Indeed, to reach the level of myself and Ozai, you need to master the basics." With that, the training session came to an end. The soldiers, still recovering from their defeat, slowly picked themselves up and retreated below deck, leaving Zuko and Iroh alone on the deck. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The two men moved to the small table where Iroh had been sitting, and Zuko joined his uncle for a cup of steaming hot tea. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly as they engaged in breathing exercises, their movements synchronized with the rhythm of the waves. Zuko focused on his breath, feeling the flow of energy within him. He inhaled deeply, drawing in the warmth of the sun, and exhaled slowly, releasing any tension in his body. Iroh guided him with gentle reminders, his voice a steady presence in the young prince's mind. As the sun continued its descent, a member of the crew approached them. She was a young woman, her face flushed with nervousness as she addressed the prince. "The Tsufuru base is on the horizon," she reported, her voice high-pitched and trembling slightly. "We should be arriving within the hour." Zuko turned to her, his golden eyes piercing as he took in her appearance. She was clearly intimidated by his presence, and he could sense the unease in her demeanor. The crew had always been wary of him, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and desire. But this young woman was different. There was something in her gaze that intrigued him, though he couldn't quite place it. "Inform the rest of the crew to prepare for disembarking," Zuko ordered, his voice firm but not unkind. The young woman nodded quickly and hurried away, eager to escape the intensity of the prince's presence. As she disappeared below deck, Iroh chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "This is going to be a very interesting trip," Iroh commented, his gaze shifting to the horizon where the Tsufuru base was coming into view. Zuko sighed, his expression darkening. "I wouldn't risk an encounter like this if the ship wasn't out of supplies and having engine issues," he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "Word getting around of my capture of the Avatar will only bring more competition." Iroh nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Indeed, the hunt for the Avatar will attract many powerful players. You must be prepared for whatever challenges lie ahead. Zuko clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. I will be ready, he said, his voice low and determined. I have to be. The two men stood at the front of the ship, their eyes fixed on the growing silhouette of the Tsufra base. The port grew larger with each passing minute, its structures becoming more distinct against the darkening sky. Zuko could feel the weight of the upcoming encounter pressing down on him, but he refused to let it shake his resolve. As the ship drew closer to the base, Zuko's mind raced with thoughts of the future. He knew that capturing the Avatar was only the beginning. The real challenge would be navigating the treacherous waters of Fire Nation politics, outmaneuvering his father and sister, and securing his place on the throne. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, and he needed to master his own abilities. The sun had nearly disappeared below the horizon by the time the ship finally docked at the Tsufra base. The crew bustled about, preparing to disembark and restock the ship's supplies. Zuko and Iroh remained on the deck, their eyes scanning the base for any signs of trouble. This is it, Zuko said, his voice barely above a whisper. The next step in my journey. Iroh placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. Remember, Zuko, he said, his voice filled with wisdom. True strength comes from within. Master your breath, master your movements, and you will master your destiny. Zuko nodded, his golden eyes gleaming with determination. He took a deep breath, feeling the fire within him burn brighter than ever. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face them. He would not falter. He would not fail. Chapter 10, Commander Zhao. The ship glided slowly into the port of the naval base, its hull battered and scarred from the relentless battles at sea. The base loomed ahead, a sprawling complex of docks, warehouses, and barracks, all overshadowed by the imposing structure of the commander's mansion. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water as the ship's anchor dropped with a heavy clang. The crew immediately sprang into action, disembarking with practiced efficiency. At the forefront of the crew were three figures, Prince Zuko, General Iroh, and Lieutenant G. Zuko's golden eyes scanned the base with a mixture of caution and disdain, his posture rigid and commanding. Iroh, ever the picture of calm, walked beside him, his hands clasped behind his back as he observed the bustling activity around them. Lieutenant G, a seasoned officer with a stern expression, led the way, his eyes darting around as if anticipating trouble. I will inform the shipmaster of the repairs we need and the extra manpower required to get us back to sea as soon as possible, Lieutenant G announced, his voice steady and authoritative. Without waiting for a response, he broke away from the group and entered a nearby building, leaving Zuko and Iroh to continue on their own. Lieutenant G, Zuko called him back. As I mentioned before, no one must know that we have the Avatar. Absolutely nobody on this island. He warned with such venom the lieutenant didn't even think of doing a leak. All they must know if they pry into our business is that the Avatar escaped. Only if they pry. Of course, sire, G said and turned to leave. He already suspected who this base was under, but he didn't recognize it from watching the show. He realized now that he was actually here. A few things might appear differently. The two turned left, heading toward the heart of the base. The commander's mansion stood out like a sore thumb, its grandeur a stark contrast to the utilitarian structures surrounding it. Zuko's eyes narrowed as they approached, his mind racing with questions. Who is the commander of this base? Zuko asked, though he already had a suspicion. His voice was low, carrying a hint of skepticism. Iroh stroked his beard thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. I'm not entirely sure myself, he admitted. I know it used to be Lieutenant Colonel too, but I believe he was promoted to Admiral some time ago. The Fire Nation has been shuffling its officers around quite a bit lately. So we've landed in an unknown military base of the Fire Nation, Zuko muttered, his tone laced with unease. This could be problematic. As they approached the entrance to the base, a group of soldiers emerged from the shadows, their armor gleaming in the fading light. At their head was a young lieutenant, no older than 20, with a cocky swagger that immediately set Zuko on edge. The lieutenant stepped forward, his eyes scanning Zuko and Iroh with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Prince Zuko, General Iroh," the lieutenant began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I am Lieutenant Tao. The commander has ordered me to escort you to the mansion." Zuko's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening at the lieutenant's tone. The man's entire demeanor reeked of arrogance, as if he were looking down on them despite their royal status. Iroh, ever the diplomat, remained calm, though even he seemed slightly taken aback by the lieutenant's attitude. "Quite the number of men you've gathered for a simple escort," Iroh remarked, his voice light but carrying an undercurrent of warning. Zuko, however, was not in the mood for diplomacy. His golden eyes flashed with anger as he stepped forward, his aura radiating an intense, almost suffocating pressure. The soldiers around him visibly flinched, their confidence wavering under the weight of his presence. "It is fine, Uncle," Zuko said, his voice cold and deadly. "Should they try anything, they will die right where they stand." The sheer force of his killer intent was overwhelming. The lieutenant, who had been so confident moments ago, suddenly found himself struggling to breathe. His knees buckled, and he dropped to the ground, his face pale with fear. The other soldiers fared no better, their hands trembling as they gripped their weapons. My apologies," the lieutenant stammered, barely able to get the words out. "This was just a precaution. There have been reports of soldiers impersonating Fire Nation officers and commandeering our ships in these waters." Zuko stepped closer, his shadow looming over the kneeling lieutenant. His aura intensified, pressing down on the man like the weight of a mountain. "The only reason you are still breathing is because I allow it," Zuko growled, his voice low and menacing. "Show me or my uncle such disrespect again, and you will forfeit your life." Before the lieutenant could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You show up unannounced to a military base and expect us not to take precautions?" The soldiers parted to reveal a middle-aged man with a bald head and long, bushy sideburns that gave him the appearance of a wild beast. His eyes were sharp, his expression calculating as he stepped forward to face Zuko and Iroh. "Captain Zhao," Iroh greeted, his voice warm despite the tension in the air. "It's been some time." "General Iroh," Zhao corrected, a sly smile playing on his lips. "It's actually Commander Zhao now." "And Prince Zuko, it's been ages." Zuko's expression remained stony, his golden eyes locked on Zhao with a mixture of disdain and suspicion. He did not return Zhao's smile, nor did he offer any pleasantries. Instead, he continued to radiate an aura of barely contained rage. "Control your men properly, Zhao," Zuko said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Treating royalty with such disrespect will only result in them forfeiting their lives needlessly." Zhao's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his expression shifting to one of mock concern. "You must understand, Prince Zuko, we are in the middle of a war," he said, his tone almost pleading. "We have lost at least a dozen ships to impersonators in these waters. We cannot afford to take any chances." "It doesn't matter, Zhao," Zuko shot back, his voice rising with anger. "That doesn't excuse them to show such utter disrespect. Next time this happens, you and your entire base will lose their right to live." Zhao's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. He had expected Zuko to be difficult, but this level of hostility was unexpected. For a moment, it seemed as though the two men might come to blows, but Iroh stepped in, his voice firm and commanding. "Enough, Zuko," Iroh said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let's leave this matter as it is for now." Zuko hesitated, his fists clenched at his sides, but he ultimately relented. He knew better than to challenge his uncle when he used that tone. Even in his current state, Zuko was nowhere near Iroh's level, a fact that had been made painfully clear during their sparring match the previous day. "Certainly, General Iroh," Zhao said, his smile returning as he accepted the ceasefire. "If your identities are indeed genuine, I have ordered Lieutenant Tao to invite you to my mansion for dinner. I trust you will join me?" Iroh nodded graciously, his demeanor calm and composed. "We would be honored, Commander Zhao." The three men continued toward the mansion, Zhao and Iroh engaging in polite conversation about the state of the war and the base's operations. Zuko followed silently, his mind racing as he maintained his facade of simmering rage. He knew Zhao was up to something, and he was determined to stay one step ahead. Unbeknownst to Zuko and Iroh, Zhao had already signaled his men to investigate the true reason for the prince's arrival at the naval base. Zuko's exile by his father was no secret, and Zhao was not one to let an opportunity for advancement slip through his fingers. A little while later, the three men sat around a lavishly set dinner table in Zhao's mansion. The tension from earlier had eased, replaced by the clinking of silverware and the soft murmur of conversation. Zuko, his rage momentarily subdued, finally allowed himself to relax as he indulged in the spread of food before him. The meal was a feast fit for royalty, with dishes ranging from roasted duck to spicy noodles, all accompanied by a variety of teas and wines. Zuko's expression softened as he savored each bite, his earlier hostility replaced by a rare moment of contentment. The conversation flowed easily, with Zhao and Iroh discussing the ongoing efforts in the Sujin province. Zhao spoke with pride about the progress his forces had made, though Iroh was quick to remind him of the limitations imposed by their current resources. "You have certainly made great strides in the area in such a short period of time," Iroh acknowledged, his tone diplomatic. "But remember, you can only do so much with the resources at your disposal. Overextending your forces could lead to unnecessary losses." Zhao nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Indeed, as you say, General. My men are already stretched thin, and I have been forced to borrow resources from nearby bases to bolster our efforts. It is an unsustainable method, but one that I believe is necessary for the time being." Zuko listened quietly, his mind working as he absorbed every word. He knew Zhao was ambitious, but he also knew the man's ambition often clouded his judgment. It was a weakness that Zuko intended to exploit. Just as the meal was winding down, Lieutenant Tao entered the dining room, his face pale and his hands trembling. He approached Zhao and whispered something in his ear, his voice barely audible. Zhao's smile vanished in an instant, replaced by a scowl that Zuko recognized all too well. The commander's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching as he turned to face Zuko. "You let the Avatar escape?" Zhao demanded, his voice rising with anger. Zuko met Zhao's gaze, his expression calm but his eyes burning with defiance. "The Avatar is not your concern, Zhao," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He is mine." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Zhao's scowl deepened, but he said nothing, his mind already racing with plans and schemes. Zuko, for his part, remained composed, his resolve unshaken. The game was far from over, and Zuko was determined to come out on top. Chapter 11, Agni Kai. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a blade. Zhao's voice thundered across the hall, his fury barely contained. "You had the Avatar captured, and yet you let him go." His words were sharp, accusatory, and dripping with disdain. Zuko, however, remained eerily calm. He sat at the table, methodically clearing his plate, his movements deliberate and unhurried. It was a habit he had developed over the past few days, his appetite had grown insatiable, as if his body were constantly seeking energy. He was eating more than he ever had before, far more than the original Zuko ever would. After finishing his meal, he reached for a goblet filled with a sweet, fruity drink and downed it in one swift motion. Brrrrgrrgrhrrr. A loud, unexpected burp erupted from him, startling everyone in the room, including himself. For a brief moment, Zuko's face flushed with embarrassment, but the feeling was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating glare. His eyes locked onto Lieutenant Tao, who stood awkwardly nearby. "The lieutenant followed my orders," Zhao interjected, stepping forward as he noticed Zuko's glare. His tone was defensive, but there was a hint of authority in his voice, as if reminding Zuko of his place. Zuko turned his attention back to Zhao, his expression calm but his eyes burning with intensity. "Indeed, I had the Avatar captured, and he did escape," Zuko stated, his voice steady but rising with each word. But that does not excuse you to use such language toward a royal, let alone the crown prince of the Fire Nation. His voice crescendoed, his face twisting into a mask of anger. The room seemed to grow hotter, the air thick with tension. Zhao sneered, his confidence unshaken. You may be royalty, but you are exiled from the Fire Nation. You are not the crown prince, and you have no authority in the Fire Nation Navy. If it weren't for the respect I have for your uncle, I would have sent you packing the moment you landed. Zuko's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. He had anticipated this confrontation, planned for it even. He had told his crew to spread the story of the Avatar's escape, knowing it would throw Zhao off his scent. As a modern man who had once watched these events unfold as a child, he knew Zhao's arrogance would blind him to the truth. Zuko was playing his part perfectly, weaving a facade to ensure no one would suspect his true intentions until he reached the safety of the Fire Nation borders. Capturing the Avatar will restore my honor as the Crown Prince and heir to the Fire Nation throne. Zuko roared, his voice echoing through the room. Capturing the Avatar is my destiny, and I will find him and capture him. Next time, he will not escape from my grasp. Zuko almost believed his own words. He was drawing on the real Zuko's emotions, his desperation, his need for redemption. It felt real, even to him. But beneath the surface, he was calculating, manipulating the situation to his advantage. Zhao's laughter cut through the tension like a knife. Capturing the Avatar should not be left to the hands of a mama's boy who couldn't take on a slug. His words were meant to sting, to provoke. And they did. A surge of pride and anger overwhelmed Zuko, and before he could think, the words spilled out of his mouth. Agni Kai, he roared, his voice shaking with fury. I challenge you to a fire duel. The room fell silent. Zhao's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with amusement. He looked at Zuko as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. Zuko, I recommend you take back your challenge, Iroh interjected, his tone calm but firm. He had been silent until now, observing the exchange with a wary eye. I refuse, Zuko shot back, his voice cold and resolute. I will not lose to scum like him. Do I need to remind you what happened the last time you fought a master? Iroh insisted, his voice tinged with concern. General Iroh, even you are aware of the rules, Zhao said, his tone dripping with mockery. Once an Agni Kai is issued, only the challenge can accept or refuse. Lieutenant Tao, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. That is correct, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Asterisk BLLMMLMGHGHML. Asterisk. Without warning, a massive ball of fire erupted from Zuko's hand, shooting across the room and enveloping Tao. The lieutenant screamed in agony, his body writhing as the flames consumed him. Zhao and Iroh immediately sprang into action, bending the flames away from Tao, but the damage had been done. Tao lay on the ground, his uniform charred, his skin burned almost as badly as the scar on Zuko's face. I already warned you, Zuko said, his voice low and menacing. That was your last warning. Next time, I will kill you. Zhao glared at Zuko, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He stood up slowly, his expression hardening as he stepped closer to the young prince. The air between them crackled with heat, the room feeling like a furnace ready to explode. I accept your challenge, Zhao declared, his voice steady but laced with venom. Tomorrow at noon, when the sun is at its highest, I will show you the true might of a firebending master. Tomorrow at high noon, then, Zuko replied, his voice equally cold. He turned and walked away, leaving the suffocating tension of the room behind. As he made his way back to his quarters on the ship, Zuko's mind raced. He had played his part perfectly, but the stakes were higher than ever. He knew Zhao would not hold back in the Agni Kai, and he needed to be ready. What the heck was that out there? Iroh's voice boomed from behind, breaking Zuko's train of thought. Zuko turned to face his uncle, feigning ignorance with a blank smile. What are you talking about? Attacking a member of the Fire Nation army for such a trivial reason? Iroh exclaimed, his voice filled with frustration. Those are the actions of Ozai and Azula. Zuko's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, emotionless expression. So what if it is? He asked bluntly. That is my father and sister. In case you haven't noticed, Uncle, our family has been responsible for the greatest era of bloodshed and massacre in history. Even you have shed innocent lives for the sake of it. Iroha's eyes widened in shock, but Zuko continued, his voice rising with each word. In your siege of Ba Sing Se, how many children lost their fathers? How many families perished because of the senile ambitions of that fool Sozin? I know you believe the Fire Nation's stance is wrong, but do not look at me with your own expectations. My destiny is to capture the Avatar and return as the hero and crown prince of the Fire Nation. I will do whatever it takes to fulfill my destiny. With that, Zuko turned and walked away, leaving Iroh standing in stunned silence. This was not the Zuko he knew. The boy he had raised, the boy he had tried to guide with wisdom and patience, was gone. In his place was someone colder, harder, and more ruthless. As Zuko disappeared into the night, Iroh couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. Meeting the Avatar had altered Zuko's mentality in ways even he couldn't fully comprehend. The boy he once knew was slipping away, replaced by someone who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. And Zuko, for his part, knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing a dangerous game, but he was determined to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Chapter 12, Agni Kai. The following day, the training grounds of the Fire Nation army were alive with tension. A crowd of nearly 1,000 soldiers had gathered, their murmurs echoing across the field like the low rumble of distant thunder. The air was thick with anticipation, for today they would witness an event that had not occurred on the island in months, an Agni Kai between masters. Or rather, between a master and an elite. Prince Zuko, though a highly skilled firebender, was not yet considered a true master like Commander Zhao. The stakes were high, and the atmosphere was electric. The sun hung high in the sky, its golden rays bathing the field in an almost oppressive heat. The spectators stood at a safe distance, their eyes fixed on the two figures standing alone in the center of the scorched earth. Both men were bare-chested, their torsos glistening with sweat as they prepared for the duel. The sun's power was at its peak, and both combatants intended to harness its full might. Zhao stood tall, his posture radiating confidence and arrogance. His eyes gleamed with a predatory light, as if he were already savoring his victory. Zuko, on the other hand, stood with a quiet intensity, his jaw clenched and his golden eyes burning with determination. The crowd could feel the tension between them, a palpable hostility that seemed to crackle in the air like static before a storm. With a sudden, explosive motion, Zhao launched the first attack. His right fist shot forward, and a massive fireball erupted from his knuckles, hurtling towards Zuko with terrifying speed. Zuko reacted instantly, sidestepping the attack with a fluid grace. He countered with a jab of his own, sending a smaller, slower fireball toward Zhao. The difference in their power was evident, but Zuko's movements were precise and calculated. Zhao sneered as he caught Zuko's fireball midair, his fingers closing around the flames as if they were mere playthings. With a flick of his wrist, he amplified the fireball, doubling its size and speed before hurling it back at Zuko. "Is that all you've got?" Zhao taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. Zuko barely had time to dodge the enhanced fireball before Zhao unleashed a barrage of attacks. 6 more fireballs followed in rapid succession, each one larger and faster than the last. The sheer speed and ferocity of the assault overwhelmed Zuko, sending him flying backward through the air. He landed hard on the ground, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. Smoke rose from his body as he struggled to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. But Zhao was not done. With a powerful leap, he soared into the air, his body silhouetted against the sun. He gathered a massive orb of fire between his hands, the flames roaring like a living beast. With a deafening cry, he hurled the fireball downward, aiming to crush Zuko beneath its weight. Zuko's instincts kicked in. Using his shoulders as a springboard, he launched himself upward, twisting his body in midair to land gracefully on his feet. Without a moment's hesitation, he propelled himself backward, executing 3 flawless backflips to evade the descending inferno. The flames crashed into the ground where he had stood moments before, sending a shockwave of heat rippling through the air. Zhao landed with a thunderous impact, his eyes narrowing as he saw Zuko still standing. With a swift, spinning motion, he redirected the flames into a rotating beam of fire, sending it hurtling toward Zuko with devastating speed. The beam struck Zuko with the force of a battering ram, sending him flying across the field. He landed in a heap, his body smoking and his breath coming in ragged gasps. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their earlier excitement replaced by a growing sense of unease. The battle was far more one-sided than anyone had anticipated. Zhao's power was overwhelming, and Zuko seemed to be struggling just to stay on his feet. "Is this the best you can muster?" Zhao roared, his voice echoing across the field. He strode toward Zuko, his every step radiating menace. Zuko pushed himself up, his body trembling with effort but his eyes still burning with defiance. He had a plan, and he intended to see it through. With a sudden burst of energy, Zuko launched his own attack. A high arc of flames erupted from his kick, followed by a low, sweeping arc from his trailing leg. Zhao sidestepped both attacks with ease, his movements almost casual. He countered with a powerful flame jab, but Zuko dodged it and closed the distance between them. The battle shifted into close combat, a flurry of punches, kicks, and fire-bending techniques. Each strike was met with a block or a dodge, the two combatants moving with a speed and precision that left the spectators in awe. The ground around them became scorched and blackened, the air thick with the smell of burning earth. For 5 intense minutes, the duel raged on, neither combatant willing to give an inch. But Zuko's inexperience began to show. He was faster than Zhao, but his attempts to overwhelm his opponent left him vulnerable. Zhao seized the opportunity, unleashing a devastating fire breath attack that struck Zuko square in the chest. The force of the blast sent Zuko sliding backward, his feet digging trenches into the ground. Zhao pressed his advantage, launching a series of increasingly powerful flame attacks. Each one was larger and faster than the last, forcing Zuko to defend with everything he had. He crossed his arms in front of his chest, absorbing the flames and dispersing them with a quick, outward motion. But Zhao was relentless. He closed the distance with a spinning back kick, sending a wide arc of flames toward Zuko. Zuko leaned back, his body bending almost parallel to the ground as the flames roared past him. The moment his feet touched the ground, he launched himself into the air, propelled by rocket-like flames. He executed 3 front flips midair, the motion intensifying the flames around him until they formed a blazing wheel of fire. With a powerful kick, he sent the charged flames hurtling toward Zhao like a concussive beam. The attack caught Zhao off guard. The sheer speed and intensity of the flames struck him with the force of a cannonball, sending him flying across the field. He landed hard, his body smoking and his arms covered in burn marks. The crowd gasped, their earlier unease replaced by a sense of awe. For the first time in a long while, Zhao had been dealt a significant blow. But Zhao was not defeated. He rose to his feet, his expression one of grim determination. He had been holding back, waiting for Zuko to push him to his limits. Now, it was time to end the duel. "Our duel has come to a close, Prince Zuko," Zhao declared, his voice ringing with confidence. "This attack is something you can never hope to dodge." Zuko felt a chill run down his spine. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to flee, but he stood his ground. The aura emanating from Zhao was overwhelming, a suffocating pressure that seemed to crush the air around him. Zhao assumed a stance that Zuko, or rather, the man that now inhabited his body, recognized immediately. It was a pose that should have been impossible for Zhao to know, a technique that was far beyond his capabilities. But there was no mistaking it. Zhao's hands and arms moved in a circular motion, and the air around him crackled with energy. Asterisk crack. Crack! Crack, asterisk. Lightning arced around Zhao's fingers, the sound like the snapping of 1,000 whips. In one fluid motion, he directed the lightning toward Zuko, the bolt streaking through the air with blinding speed. Zuko's mind raced. He remembered every scene, every detail about lightning generation and redirection. At the last possible moment, he thrust his right hand toward the lightning, his body bracing for the impact. The moment the lightning struck, a searing pain coursed through his body, as if every nerve were on fire. He barely managed to raise his left hand, allowing the current to pass through him and into the ground. When the lightning subsided, Zuko's body was covered in burns, smoke rising from his skin like a coal power station. He collapsed to the ground, his strength utterly spent. Chapter 13, Aftermath and Awakening. Zuko awoke to the sensation of being buried alive. His body felt heavy, as if weighed down by an invisible force, and every breath was a struggle against the tight bandages wrapped around his chest. The air was stale, and the room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering lantern hanging from the ceiling. He blinked slowly, his vision blurry as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. He was no longer on the scorched battlefield but back in his quarters aboard the ship. The familiar metal walls and the faint hum of the engine reassured him that he was safe, or at least as safe as one could be after being struck by lightning. As his senses gradually returned, he noticed his uncle, Iroh, sitting in a chair beside the bed. The old man was slumped forward, his head resting on his chest, his soft snores filling the room. Zuko's heart ached at the sight. Iroh had clearly been keeping vigil over him, and the exhaustion was written plainly on his face. Zuko tried to sit up, but the moment he moved, a searing pain shot through his body, radiating from his chest to his limbs. He let out a strangled scream, the sound sharp and guttural, like the cry of a wounded animal. The noise jolted Iroh awake. The old man's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, he looked disoriented, as if he had been pulled from a deep dream. What happened? Is it the Earth Kingdom? He blurted out, his voice tinged with panic. But his confusion quickly faded when he saw Zuko writhing in pain on the bed. The bandages covering Zuko's body were so tight that he resembled a mummy, his skin pale and slick with sweat beneath the layers of cloth. CGGHGNY might oidhide of gigs. Zuko tried to speak, but the bandages covering his mouth muffled his words, turning them into incoherent gibberish. Iroh stared at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. But the confusion soon gave way to concern, and without a word, he leaned forward and began unwrapping the bandages from Zuko's face. The process was slow and careful, but Zuko could feel the sting of the burns beneath the cloth, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his body. Once the bandages were removed, Zuko opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a single word, Iroh grabbed a metal cup of water from the nightstand and pressed it to his lips. Zuko tried to resist, but Iroh's grip was firm, and the water poured into his mouth, cool and soothing against his parched throat. The liquid had a bitter aftertaste, and Zuko realized it must have been laced with some kind of medicinal herb. He drank reluctantly, the water easing the burning sensation in his throat and chest. When the cup was empty, Iroh set it aside and sank back into his chair, his expression unreadable. For several minutes, the two sat in silence, the only sound the faint creaking of the ship and the distant hum of the engine. Zuko avoided eye contact, his mind racing as he tried to process what had happened. The memory of the Agni Kai was still fresh in his mind, the image of Zhao's lightning crackling through the air like a serpent of pure energy. He had been defeated, humiliated, and left broken on the battlefield. The thought filled him with a bitter sense of shame. But beneath the shame was something else, a cold, calculating clarity. Zhao had been stronger than expected, far stronger than he had been in the series. The ability to generate lightning was a skill reserved for only the most prodigious firebenders, and Zhao had wielded it with terrifying precision. Zuko had underestimated him, and it had nearly cost him his life. But the defeat had also revealed something important: this world was not the same as the one he remembered. The rules had changed, and he could no longer rely on his knowledge of the show to guide him. He would have to adapt, to forge his own path. The silence between him and Iroh was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Zuko knew his uncle was worried, but he also knew that Iroh would not press him for answers. The old man had always respected his boundaries, even when it pained him to do so. But Zuko could not let the silence linger forever. He took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in his ribs, and finally broke the silence. "I guess I lost, huh?" he said, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. Iroh turned to him, his expression softening. "Zhao has grown stronger since I last saw him," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Only a handful of firebenders can generate lightning, and he is now among them. You could not have known." Zuko shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice firm despite the pain. "All that matters is that he bought it. He doesn't know we still have the Avatar captured on the ship. When we leave this naval base, there won't be anyone else who knows the truth. Besides, a true master would have anticipated any scenario in a duel. I should have been prepared." Iroh wanted to argue, to offer words of comfort, but he knew Zuko was right. The boy had always been hard on himself, but this time, his self-criticism was justified. "In a fight between masters," Iroh said slowly, "one should not come with expectations. Those expectations can shatter in the face of true adversity." Zuko nodded, his expression grim. "True," he agreed. "But I still think I could have won if I had actually tried. I didn't go into the fight intending to lose, but I also didn't want to win. If I had defeated Zhao, his resentment toward me would have grown, and he would have caused even more trouble. The lightning was a surprise, but in a way, it was a blessing in disguise." Iroh's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his eyes searching Zuko's face. "Going into a fight with the intention to lose is not a habit you want to cultivate, Zuko," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "I know, Uncle," Zuko replied, his tone weary. "And I know it's dishonorable. I didn't go into the fight to lose, but I also didn't want to win. My pride wouldn't allow me to just throw the match, which is why I'm glad Zhao's lightning attack came when it did. It gave me an out." Iroh's expression darkened, and he opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a loud banging on the door interrupted them. The sound was sharp and insistent, echoing through the room like a gunshot. "Come in," Iroh called, his voice firm. The door creaked open, and Lieutenant G stepped inside. His eyes immediately fell on Zuko, and he nodded respectfully. "Prince Zuko," he said, his tone formal but not unkind. "I see you're awake. How are you feeling?" Zuko managed a weak smile, though it was more of a grimace. "Well, I was struck by lightning and wrapped in bandages from head to toe. My whole body feels like it's on fire, but other than that, I couldn't be better." G's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm glad to hear you're awake," he said. "The repairs to the ship are complete, and we're ready to resume our search for the Avatar." The way G emphasized the word Avatar made Zuko's stomach twist. He realized that someone must have been listening outside the door, and G was being careful not to reveal too much. Zuko was grateful for the lieutenant's discretion, but his relief was short-lived. A sudden, horrifying realization struck him, and his eyes widened in panic. "How long have I been out?" he asked, his voice trembling. Chapter 14, The Path Forward. Mui and Iroh exchanged a brief, knowing glance, their expressions unreadable but laden with unspoken thoughts. Iroh turned back to his nephew, his face a mask of calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "The Agni Kai was yesterday," Iroh said, his voice steady and measured. "So, at most, you've been unconscious for half a day." Zuko breathed a sigh of relief, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He had feared that he had been out for days, perhaps even weeks, and the thought of losing so much time had filled him with dread. But half a day was manageable. Still, he couldn't afford to waste any more time. His body was a wreck, every movement sending sharp jolts of pain through his muscles, but the urgency of their mission pressed down on him like a weight. With a groan, Zuko willed himself to sit up, his muscles protesting with every inch he gained. The pain was excruciating, a constant, burning ache that seemed to radiate from his very bones. His face contorted in a grimace, and a low, guttural sound escaped his lips as he pushed through the agony. "What are you doing?" Iroh exclaimed, jumping to his feet. "You need to lie down and recover." You're in no condition to be moving around. Let me just sit up, uncle. Zuko snapped, his voice strained but firm. He gritted his teeth and forced himself upright, his body trembling with the effort. The strain on his face was evident, his skin pale and slick with sweat, but his golden eyes burned with determination. Chart a course for Kyoshi Island. We must depart immediately. We cannot afford to waste any more time here. Iroh hesitated, his hands hovering uncertainly in the air as if he wanted to push Zuko back down but knew better than to try. After a moment, he sighed and sank back into his chair, his expression a mixture of resignation and worry. Why Kyoshi Island? He asked, his tone cautious. Just trust me, Zuko replied, his voice tight with pain and urgency. Chart a course at our fastest speed. We need to move now. Iroh studied his nephew for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. There was something different about Zuko, something that had been growing more pronounced since their encounter with the Avatar. The boy had always been driven, but now there was a new edge to his determination, a calculating sharpness that Iroh couldn't quite place. It was as if Zuko had glimpsed something that had changed him in ways Iroh couldn't yet understand. Understood, Lieutenant G said, breaking the silence. He had been standing quietly by the door, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp with curiosity. I will inform the crew immediately. Remember, Lieutenant G, Zuko added, his voice firm despite his weakened state. No stops. Head straight for Kyoshi. Understood, G confirmed with a nod. He turned on his heel and left the chamber, the heavy metal door closing behind him with a resounding clang. Once again, Zuko and Iroh were left alone in the room, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. Iroh leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he studied his nephew. The changes in Zuko's behavior had not gone unnoticed. The boy had always been stubborn and driven, but now there was a new layer to his actions, a sense of purpose that went beyond his quest to capture the Avatar. Iroh couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened during Zuko's private conversation with the Avatar, something that had altered his perspective in profound and unexpected ways. Zuko, meanwhile, stared blankly at the wall, his mind racing. The events of the past few days played over and over in his head like a relentless storm. The Agni Kai, Zhao's lightning, the Avatar's capture, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle that he was only beginning to understand. The world he had found himself in was not the same as the one he remembered from the show. Zhao's unexpected strength was proof of that. If even Zhao had grown stronger, what did that mean for others like Azula or Ozai? The rules had changed, and Zuko could no longer rely on his knowledge of the series to guide him. He would have to adapt, to forge his own path. But there was more to it than that. The realization had been gnawing at him ever since he awoke in this world. His life was not entirely his own. Someone, or something, had brought him here, and that entity was pulling the strings from the shadows. The thought filled him with a cold, creeping dread, but it also ignited a fierce determination. If he was going to survive in this world, he would need to grow stronger, stronger than he had ever been before. His thoughts turned to the Avatar and his friends, locked away in the brig below. He needed to speak with them, to glean whatever information he could. But more than that, he needed to confront the reality of his situation. His knowledge of future events, of Avatar 1, Rava, and Vatu, the harmonic convergence, was both a blessing and a curse. It gave him an edge, but it also tied him to a narrative that might no longer hold true. He couldn't afford to be complacent. He needed to act, and quickly. Zuko's gaze shifted to his uncle, who was still deep in thought. The old man's face was lined with worry, his eyes distant as he pondered the changes in his nephew. Zuko knew that Iroh was trying to understand him, to piece together the fragments of his behavior into a coherent whole. But there were some things Zuko couldn't explain, not yet, at least. "Uncle," Zuko said, his voice breaking the silence. "I need you to teach me how to generate lightning." Iroh's eyes snapped to Zuko, his expression one of surprise and concern. "Lightning generation is an advanced technique, Zuko," he said slowly. "It requires not only great skill but also a calm and focused mind. It is not something to be taken lightly. I know, Zuko replied, his voice steady. But I need to learn it. Zhao's strength caught me off guard, and I can't afford to be unprepared again. If I'm going to survive in this world, I need to be stronger. Iroh studied his nephew for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, though his eyes still held a trace of worry. Very well, he said. But understand this, Zuko, lightning generation is as much about control as it is about power. It requires a balance of mind and spirit. If you are not ready, it could destroy you. Zuko met his uncle's gaze, his expression resolute. I understand, he said. And I'm ready. Zuko knew that Iroh must be wondering about the shifts in his behavior, the newfound cunning, the strategic thinking, the almost ruthless determination. It was a risk Zuko was willing to take. If Iroh grew suspicious, so be it. Zuko couldn't afford to hide his intentions, not when the stakes were this high. He needed his uncle's guidance, even if it meant revealing more of himself than he was comfortable with. As he lay there, his body still racked with pain, Zuko's mind wandered to the larger implications of his presence in this world. His very existence here was likely one of the reasons things had changed so drastically. The thought had crossed his mind before, but now it felt more pressing. When he had first decided to deviate from the canon of the show, he had expected some changes, a butterfly effect of sorts. But the extent of the alterations had taken him by surprise. Zhao's newfound ability to generate lightning was just one example. It was as if the world itself was shifting to accommodate his presence, and that terrified him. But it also confirmed another hypothesis: he wasn't entirely at fault for the changes. There was something else at play, something larger and more insidious. The rules of this world were not as fixed as he had once believed. His knowledge of the future was still valuable, but it was no longer a reliable map. He would have to navigate this world with caution, always prepared for the unexpected. His thoughts drifted back to the early days after he had first awakened in Zuko's body. He remembered the conversation with Iroh, the one where his uncle had tried to teach him the basics of firebending. At the time, Zuko had been surprised by how easily the flames came to him. It wasn't just skill, it was something deeper. He had more chi than Zuko ever did, at least in the show. His potential was greater, his connection to fire more profound. It was both a blessing and a curse. The realization had filled him with a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, it meant he had the potential to become stronger than he had ever imagined. On the other hand, it raised troubling questions. If he had more chi than the original Zuko, what did that mean for others in this world? Azula, for example, was already a prodigy, her abilities bordering on the absurd. If her potential had also increased, the thought was enough to send a chill down his spine. The idea of facing an even stronger Azula was terrifying, but it also stirred something else in him, a dark, almost primal desire. Azula had always been a fascinating character to him, even before he found himself in this world. Her intelligence, her power, her ruthlessness, it was intoxicating. And now, the thought of her being even stronger, even more dangerous, only intensified his feelings. He knew it was wrong, knew that she was technically his sister, but he couldn't bring himself to care. The taboo of incest meant nothing to him. He was a grown man from Earth, thrust into the body of a teenager in a world that was both familiar and alien. The moral boundaries of this world didn't apply to him, not in the same way. His desires were his own, and he would not deny them. But those thoughts were for another time. Right now, he needed to focus on the task at hand. He needed to grow stronger, to prepare for the challenges ahead. And that meant learning from Iroh, no matter the cost. Chapter 15, Plan Unveiled. The naval base grew smaller and smaller on the horizon, its imposing structures and bustling docks fading into the distance as the ship cut through the waves. Prince Zuko stood on the deck, his body still wrapped in bandages, his muscles aching with every breath. His uncle, Iroh, stood beside him, one hand resting gently on Zuko's shoulder to steady him. The old man's expression was a mixture of concern and curiosity, his eyes scanning his nephew's face for any sign of the turmoil that had been brewing within him since their encounter with Zhao. Zuko's golden eyes remained fixed on the horizon, his jaw clenched as he watched the base disappear. Despite the pain that racked his body, a sense of relief washed over him. Things could have gone far worse. Zhao's newfound ability to generate lightning had been a shock, literally and figuratively, but Zuko had survived. The Agni Kai had been a close call, but it had also revealed something crucial: this world was not the same as the one he remembered from the show. The rules had changed, and Zuko could no longer rely on his knowledge of the series to guide him. He would have to adapt, to forge his own path. "Uncle," Zuko said, his voice low but firm, breaking the silence between them. "Now is the time. I need to speak with the Avatar." Iroha's brow furrowed, his hand tightening slightly on Zuko's shoulder. "The Avatar?" he asked, his tone cautious. "What could you possibly have to discuss with him?" "He is our prisoner, Zuko. Our mission is to bring him to the Fire Nation, not to engage in conversation." Zuko turned to face his uncle, his expression resolute despite the pain etched into his features. "I've spent the last 3 years researching the Avatar, Uncle," he said, his voice steady. "I've studied every scroll, every text, every legend I could find. There are very few individuals in this world who know more about the Avatar than I do. And now that we have him, I need to use that knowledge." Iroha's eyes narrowed, his curiosity piqued. "And what do you intend to do with this knowledge, Zuko?" he asked, his voice tinged with both concern and intrigue. "What is your plan?" Zuko's gaze shifted back to the horizon, his mind racing as he formulated his next words. He knew his uncle would be skeptical, perhaps even resistant, but he also knew that Iroha's wisdom and guidance would be invaluable in the days to come. "On Kyoshi Island," Zuko began, his voice measured, "there is someone I need to meet. Someone who can help me understand the Avatar in ways no one else can." Iroha's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "Kyoshi Island," he repeated, his tone incredulous. "Who on Kyoshi Island could possibly have the knowledge you seek? The island is known for its warriors, not its scholars. I thought you were simply selling the story to Zhao's men." Zuko turned to face his uncle once more, his golden eyes locking onto Iroha's. "Kyoshi herself," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I need to speak with Avatar Kyoshi." For a moment, Iroha was silent, his eyes widening in surprise. The idea was audacious, even by Zuko's standards. Avatar Kyoshi had been dead for centuries, her legacy preserved only in stories and legends. The thought of speaking with her was absurd, or so it seemed. But Iroha knew better than to dismiss his nephew's words outright. Zuko had always been driven, but now there was a new edge to his determination, a calculating sharpness that Iroha couldn't quite place. "Zuko," Iroha said slowly, his voice tinged with caution, "Avatar Kyoshi has been gone for generations. How do you expect to speak with her? The dead do not return to the living, no matter how much we may wish it." Zuko's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. In the live-action remake of the show, Aang was able to communicate with the past avatars through their shrines. He didn't need the avatar state or any special rituals. He simply went to their places of power and spoke with them. The closest shrine to them is Kyoshi's. If he can reach it, he can speak with her. Iroha's brow furrowed as he processed Zuko's words. The idea was unconventional, to say the least, but it was not entirely without merit. Iroha had seen many strange things in his long life, and he knew that the world was far more mysterious than most people realized. Still, the thought of Zuko seeking guidance from a long-dead avatar was unsettling. "And what do you hope to gain from speaking with Kyoshi?" Iroha asked, his voice cautious. "What knowledge could she possibly offer you that you do not already possess?" Zuko's expression hardened, his eyes burning with determination. "There are some things that I need to understand better about the Avatar," he said. In truth, what he wanted to know was if there were any spiritual shenanigans going on. If anyone knew how he ended up in this world, then maybe it would be someone already in the spirit world. He suspected that the only plausible explanation for his soul taking over that of Zuko's might be the work of spirits, powerful and ancient spirits at that. Maybe on the same level as that of Rava and Vatu. Just like Roku in the show, maybe Kyoshi could provide some much-needed future foresight. His knowledge of the future events were too unreliable given the change he experienced while fighting Zhao. Iroh studied his nephew for a long moment, his expression unreadable. There was something different about Zuko, something that had been growing more pronounced since their encounter with the Avatar. The boy had always been driven, but now there was a new layer to his actions, a sense of purpose that went beyond his quest to capture the Avatar. Iroh couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened during Zuko's private conversation with the Avatar, something that had altered his perspective in profound and unexpected ways. "And after you speak with Kyoshi?" Iroh asked, his voice quiet but firm. "What then?" Zuko's gaze shifted back to the horizon, his jaw tightening as he considered the question. "Then we go to the Fire Nation capital," he said, his voice resolute. "We bring the Avatar before my father and reclaim my rightful place as Crown Prince. But I won't do it blindly, Uncle. I need to know what I'm walking into. I need to be prepared." Iroh's expression softened, a flicker of pride shining in his eyes. For all his stubbornness and impulsiveness, Zuko had always been a thinker, a strategist. But now, there was a new depth to his planning, a level of foresight that Iroh hadn't seen before. It was as if Zuko had glimpsed something that had changed him in ways Iroh couldn't yet understand. "Very well," Iroh said, his voice steady. "If this is the path you choose, then I will support you. But remember, Zuko, the road ahead is fraught with danger. You must tread carefully." Zuko nodded, his expression resolute. "I know, Uncle," he said, his voice firm. "But I have no other choice. This is the only way." As the ship sailed on, the wind carrying them closer to Kyoshi Island, Zuko's mind raced with thoughts of the future. The world he had found himself in was not the same as the one he remembered, and the rules had changed. But Zuko was determined to adapt, to forge his own path. And if that meant seeking guidance from a long-dead Avatar, then so be it. The game was far from over, and Zuko was determined to come out on top. Chapter 16, The Weight of a Century. Zuko limped down the narrow, dimly lit corridor of the ship, his body still wrapped in bandages, the faint smell of medicinal herbs clinging to him. His steps were slow and deliberate, each movement sending a dull ache through his muscles. The burns on his exposed skin, his arms, neck, and parts of his face, were still raw, but the pain had subsided enough for him to move without wincing at every step. He had insisted on going to the brig alone, despite Iroh's protests. This was a conversation he needed to have without his uncle's calming presence. This was between him and the Avatar. The brig was cold and damp, the metal walls reflecting the faint glow of the lanterns hanging from the ceiling. The sound of Zuko's uneven footsteps echoed as he approached the cell where Aang, Katara, and Sokka were being held. The three of them were huddled together, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension as they saw Zuko approaching. His appearance was startling, bandages covered most of his body, and the burns that peeked through were a stark reminder of whatever battle he had just endured. Sokka was the first to speak, his tone as sarcastic as ever. Well, look who decided to visit. What happened to you? Lose a fight with a cactus or something?" Zuko stopped in front of the cell, his golden eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded Sokka. "I fought a firebending master," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I was shot by lightning." The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Aang's eyes widened, and Katara gasped softly. Even Sokka's sarcastic smirk faded, replaced by a look of genuine surprise. "Wait, what?" Aang asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Why is the Fire Nation fighting amongst themselves?" Zuko's gaze shifted to Aang, his expression unreadable. "Because of you, Aang," he said without hesitation. "It hasn't just been the rest of the world searching for the Avatar this past century. Ever since my grandfather, Fire Lord Sozin, killed off all the airbenders that fateful night you ran away on Appa. We've been searching for you. Aang's face fell, his shoulders slumping as guilt washed over him. His gray eyes filled with sorrow, and he looked down at his feet, unable to meet Zuko's gaze. Katara placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her expression a mix of anger and concern. "Wipe that look off your face," Zuko said sharply, his tone cutting through the heavy silence. "It was actually a good thing you left that night, Aang. Otherwise, you might not be here, and this war would have ended a long time ago." Aang's head snapped up, his eyes wide with confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. Zuko leaned against the metal bars of the cell, his arms crossed over his chest. "Well, I say it's a good thing because the war dragged on," he continued, his voice steady. "But it's only good for the Fire Nation that you ran away." Katara's brow furrowed, her protective instincts kicking in. "What are you talking about, Zuko? How is it good for the Fire Nation that Aang ran away?" Zuko's gaze shifted to Katara, his expression calm but intense. "Surely you must have given it some thought since you found him frozen in that ice block," he said, his tone almost mocking. "Not even you, Sokka, with all your brains, didn't think about it?" Sokka's eyes narrowed, his usual sarcasm replaced by genuine curiosity. "Just tell us already, would ya?" Zuko sighed, pushing himself off the bars and standing upright. "Very well, then," he said. "Imagine this scenario. Aang was just playing with the other Airbender kids at the Southern Air Temple, right? His mentor and master, Monk Gyatso, calls him over to the side and tells him of his identity as the next Avatar. At the mention of Monk Gyatso, Aang's eyes widened, and his body tensed. "How do you know about Monk Gyatso?" he demanded, his voice rising with anger. "How do you know any of this?" The air in the brig grew tense, and a sudden gust of wind swirled around the cell, rattling the metal bars. Aang's eyes burned with fury, his hands clenched into fists. Katara quickly stepped in front of him, her hands raised in a calming gesture. "Aang, stop," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Calm down." Zuko, however, remained unfazed. He didn't flinch at the sudden burst of wind or the anger in Aang's eyes. He simply stood there, his expression calm and unimpressed. "I'll explain everything to you, Aang," Zuko said, his voice steady. "But only to you. And I'll do it soon. For now, just calm down." Katara placed a hand on Aang's chest, her touch soothing as she tried to calm him. After a few moments, the wind died down, and Aang's shoulders slumped, his anger giving way to exhaustion. Zuko waited until the room was quiet again before continuing. "So, where were we?" he said, as if nothing had happened. "Ah, yes. Monk Gyatso tells Aang that there are rumors of a possible threat from the Fire Nation." He paused, his gaze shifting to Sokka and Katara. "Isn't that weird?" he asked, his tone almost conversational. The air nomads, the elders, knew the Fire Nation was building an army to attack for years before they told Aang. Before the Earth Kingdom spies in the Fire Nation capital were even falsely given information that the first strike would happen somewhere in the Earth Kingdom. Aang's eyes filled with tears as Zuko's words brought back memories that felt like only a few days ago to him but were, in reality, 100 years old. The image of Monk Gyatso, the Southern Air Temple, the other Airbender children, it all came rushing back, and Aang began to sob quietly. Katara wrapped her arms around him, her own eyes glistening with tears as she comforted him. "Zuko, stop," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You've made your point. Just stop." Zuko looked at Aang, the young boy of just 12, burdened with so much responsibility at such a young age. For a moment, Zuko felt a pang of guilt. He remembered sitting in his living room, watching this same boy go through so much pain in order to defeat Ozai. The same Ozai who was now his father in this world. The nostalgia of that moment hit him hard, and he felt a strange mix of emotions, sympathy, resolve, and a deep sense of responsibility. "I'm sorry, Aang," Zuko said, his voice sincere and heartfelt. The words surprised everyone in the room, even Zuko himself. "I really am sorry. But the thing is, the world isn't going to wait for you to be ready. He took a deep breath, his golden eyes locking onto Aang's tear-filled ones. So let me get to my point so you'll maybe realize why it might have been better if you died with the Airbenders on that fateful day. The words were cruel, and Katara's eyes flashed with anger, but Zuko pressed on, his voice steady and unyielding. You see, if Fire Lord Sozin had managed to kill you that day, it would have meant the war would last only 20 years at most, not 5 times that amount. The next Avatar would have been born into the Water Tribes. She would have been from the south or north, and back then, both tribes were considerably stronger than they are now. With the Avatar on their side, plus the support of the mighty Earth Kingdom, there would have been no chance for the Fire Nation. Zuko's gaze hardened, his voice taking on a bitter edge. But you being alive and frozen in ice for a century delayed the Fire Nation's defeat and diminished the other nations' hopes. It delayed the Fire Nation's defeat long enough for it to turn into a win. A win that's now just around the corner. The room fell silent, the weight of Zuko's words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Aang's sobs had quieted, but his face was still streaked with tears. Katara held him tightly, her own eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. Sokka stood silently, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a look of deep thought. Zuko turned and began to walk away, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He had said what he needed to say. Now, it was up to Aang to decide what to do with that knowledge. Zuko paused at the door of the brig, his hand resting on the cold metal frame. He turned back to face Aang, his golden eyes piercing through the dim light. The room was heavy with silence, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. Aang's tear-streaked face looked up at him, confusion and sorrow etched into his features. Katara held him tightly, her protective embrace a shield against the harsh truth Zuko had just laid bare. Sokka stood silently, his arms crossed, his usual sarcasm replaced by a rare moment of introspection. Zuko took a deep breath, his voice steady but softer now, as if he were delivering a final blow that he knew would hurt but was necessary. If you had died back then, he said, his tone almost clinical, the number of casualties would not be in the tens of millions. It would have been a few thousand, maybe a few 100,000 at most. The war would have been shorter, sharper, and far less devastating. He paused, letting the words sink in. Aang's breath hitched, and Katara's grip on him tightened. Sokka's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Zuko's words were cruel, but they were also undeniably true. The war had dragged on for a century, and the cost had been unimaginable. Entire nations had been ravaged, families torn apart, and cultures nearly wiped out. The Fire Nation's relentless pursuit of power had left scars on the world that would take generations to heal. Zuko's gaze softened slightly as he looked at Aang. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty for being alive, Aang, he said, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. In fact, I'm glad you are alive. You'll understand what I mean by all of this very soon. Aang's eyes widened, confusion mixing with the sorrow. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zuko's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. One of your past lives will explain it to you when we reach her, he said cryptically. You'll see. With that, Zuko turned and walked out of the brig, the heavy metal door clanging shut behind him. The sound echoed through the corridor, leaving the three friends in stunned silence. Aang slumped against Katara, his body trembling as the weight of Zuko's words settled over him. Katara stroked his head gently, her own heart aching for him. Sokka stood nearby, his usual bravado replaced by a rare moment of quiet reflection. Aang sat in silence, his head resting against Katara's shoulder. The tears had stopped, but the weight of Zuko's words still pressed down on him like a physical force. He felt small, insignificant, and utterly overwhelmed. How could he, a 12-year-old boy, possibly make up for a century of war and suffering? How could he carry the hopes of an entire world on his shoulders? Katara's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and reassuring. Aang, don't listen to him, she said, her tone firm but gentle. You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't choose to be the Avatar. And you're not responsible for what happened to the Airbenders or the war. You're just a kid. Aang looked up at her, his gray eyes filled with doubt. But what if he's right, Katara? He asked, his voice trembling. What if the world would have been better off if I had died that night? Katara's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled him into a tight hug. Don't say that, she whispered fiercely. The world needs you, Aang. You're the Avatar. You're the only one who can bring balance back. Sokka, who had been silent until now, stepped forward and placed a hand on Aang's shoulder. Listen, buddy, he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. Zuko's a jerk, and he's got a lot of nerve saying all that stuff. But he's also right about one thing, the world isn't going to wait for you to be ready. So we'll just have to get you ready faster. Aang looked at Sokka, a small flicker of hope igniting in his chest. How? He asked. Chapter 17, Kyoshi Island Arrival. The midday sun hung high in the sky, its golden rays reflecting off the calm, azure waters of the sea. The air was warm, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and the distant cries of seabirds. Prince Zuko stood on the deck of his ship, his hands gripping the railing as he stared out at the horizon. His body was still wrapped in bandages, the faint smell of medicinal herbs clinging to him, but he refused to let the pain show. His golden eyes were fixed on the distant silhouette of Kyoshi Island, which was slowly coming into focus as the ship cut through the waves. Iroh stood beside him, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression calm but thoughtful. The old man's eyes occasionally flicked toward his nephew, studying him with a mixture of concern and pride. Lieutenant G was a few paces behind them, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back as he awaited orders. The crew moved about the deck with practiced efficiency, but there was an air of anticipation among them. They were nearing their destination, and the tension was palpable. Zuko's gaze remained locked on the island as it grew larger on the horizon. The silhouette of Kyoshi Island was unmistakable, its towering cliffs, dense forests, and the faint outline of the village nestled along the coast. The island was a place of legend, a place that had been shaped by the power of the Avatar herself. Zuko's mind wandered back to the stories he had read, the scrolls he had pored over during his years of exile. He had been obsessed with the Avatar, with the history of the Avatars who had come before Aang. And now, as he stood on the deck of his ship, he felt a strange sense of destiny pulling him toward the island. Kyoshi Island, Zuko said, his voice low but firm, breaking the silence. A place steeped in history. A place where the Avatar once walked. Iroh turned to him, his brow raised in curiosity. You seem to know a great deal about this island, Prince Zuko, he said, his tone gentle but probing. Care to share your knowledge with an old man? Zuko's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. During the era of Avatar Kyoshi, he began, his voice steady, a ruthless tyrant named Chin the Conqueror rose to power. He was a man who sought to unite the Earth Kingdom under his rule, but his methods were brutal. He conquered village after village, leaving destruction in his wake. When he finally reached the peninsula where Kyoshi and her people lived, he demanded their surrender. Zuko paused, his eyes narrowing as he recalled the story. But Kyoshi refused. She was not one to bow to tyranny. Instead, she used her incredible bending abilities to separate the peninsula from the Earth Kingdom mainland, creating what we now know as Kyoshi Island. Chin, in his arrogance, tried to pursue her, but he was no match for the Avatar. He fell to his death, and Kyoshi's people were saved. Iroh nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. A remarkable tale, he said. And one that speaks to the power of the Avatar. But why are we here, Prince Zuko? What do you hope to find on Kyoshi Island? Zuko's gaze shifted to his uncle, his golden eyes burning with determination. I've spent the last 3 years researching the Avatar, he said, his voice firm. I've studied every scroll, every text, every legend I could find. There are very few individuals in this world who know more about the Avatar than I do. And now that we have him, I need to use that knowledge. Lieutenant G stepped forward, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp with curiosity. And what knowledge do you seek, my prince? He asked, his tone respectful. Zuko turned to face him, his expression resolute. On Kyoshi Island, he said, there is a shrine to Avatar Kyoshi. It is a place of great spiritual power, a place where the Avatar's presence can still be felt. I believe that by visiting this shrine, I can gain insight into the Avatar's past, and perhaps even his future. Ji nodded, his expression thoughtful. Of course, my prince, he said. I will prepare the men for disembarking. Zuko's gaze shifted back to the island, his expression hardening. Be aware, Lieutenant, he said, his voice low and serious. A great serpent lives in the waters surrounding Kyoshi Island. A serpent that could destroy a dozen ships in less than an hour. Make sure the men are prepared for any eventuality. Ji's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. Yes, my prince, he said, bowing slightly before turning to carry out his orders. Iroh watched as Ji walked away, his expression unreadable. When he turned back to Zuko, there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. So, you even know of the great Unagi of Kyoshi Island, he said, his tone light but probing. I must admit, Prince Zuko, your knowledge continues to impress me. Zuko's expression softened slightly, and he let out a long sigh. I learned about it during our first year of exile, he said, his voice tinged with sadness. Back then, I was consumed by anger and frustration. I didn't understand why my father had banished me, why he had cast me aside like I was nothing. He paused, his gaze dropping to the deck as he recalled those dark days. But things have changed since then, he continued, his voice growing stronger. I've grown. I've matured. Maybe it was my destiny to be exiled by my father so that one day I could return a hero. Iroh's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Zuko's shoulder. Your father is not the type to think like that, Prince Zuko, he said, his voice gentle but firm. He exiled you purely because he saw you as a threat. He didn't want you around to weaken him. Zuko's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, weary sigh. I know, uncle, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But you have to admit, it does seem like destiny, doesn't it? Iroh studied his nephew for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Indeed it does, he said finally, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. The once heir to the throne, who had it stolen by his little brother. The prince who was cast out, only to return stronger and wiser. If that is not destiny, then I do not know what is. Zuko raised his head, his golden eyes locking onto Iroh's. For a moment, there was a flicker of hope in his gaze, a glimmer of the boy he had once been. But then his expression hardened, and he turned back to the horizon, his jaw tightening with determination. Prepare the men, uncle, he said, his voice firm. We have work to do. Iroh nodded, his hand still resting on Zuko's shoulder. As you wish, Prince Zuko, he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. As you wish. The ship continued to cut through the waves, the silhouette of Kyoshi Island growing larger with each passing moment. Zuko's mind raced with thoughts of the future, of the challenges that lay ahead. He knew that the path before him would not be easy, but he was determined to see it through. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of destiny. And as the shores of Kyoshi Island came into view, he knew that his journey was only just beginning. Zuko stood in his quarters, his reflection staring back at him from the small, cracked mirror mounted on the wall. The bandages that had once covered his chest and arms were now discarded, piled in a heap on the floor. His body was still a patchwork of bruises and burns, the skin raw and tender where Zhao's lightning had struck him. Every movement sent a sharp jolt of pain through his muscles, but he refused to let it show. He was a prince of the Fire Nation, and he would not be seen as weak. He adjusted his uniform, the familiar red and black fabric fitting snugly against his frame. The high-collared tunic was adorned with gold trim, the Fire Nation emblem emblazoned on the chest. The sleeves were long and fitted, ending in pointed cuffs that brushed against his wrists. His belt was cinched tightly around his waist, the golden buckle gleaming in the dim light. The uniform was a symbol of his status, a reminder of who he was and what he had to do. He straightened his posture, his golden eyes narrowing as he prepared himself for what came next. With a deep breath, Zuko turned and walked out of his quarters, his boots echoing against the metal floor as he made his way to the lower decks. The ship was alive with activity, the crew preparing for their arrival on Kyoshi Island, but Zuko's mind was focused on one thing, the Avatar. The brig was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of salt and mildew. The faint glow of lanterns cast long shadows on the metal walls, and the sound of Zuko's footsteps echoed as he descended the stairs. The guards stationed at the entrance snapped to attention as he approached, their expressions neutral but their eyes sharp with curiosity. Zuko ignored them, his gaze fixed on the cell at the end of the corridor. Inside the cell, Aang, Katara, and Sokka were huddled together, their expressions a mix of apprehension and defiance as they saw Zuko approaching. The prince stopped in front of the cell, his golden eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded them. His appearance was startling, his uniform pristine, but the burns and bruises on his exposed skin a stark reminder of the battle he had just endured. Well, Sokka said, his tone as sarcastic as ever. Look who decided to visit. You look a bit better, Prince Zuko. Did you finally get some beauty sleep? Zuko's expression remained impassive, his voice calm but firm. Indeed, he said simply, his gaze shifting to Aang. It's time, Aang. We've arrived on Kyoshi Island. Aang's eyes widened, and he took a step forward, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. Tell me, Zuko, he began, his voice tinged with disbelief. How do you know about Monk Gyatso and what happened on that day 100 years ago? You don't look 100 years old to me. Zuko's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. You don't look 112 years old either, Aang, he said, his tone dry. But worry not. Your questions will be answered soon. He turned to the guards standing behind him and signaled them to enter the cell. The guards stepped forward, heavy chains in their hands, their expressions grim. Zuko turned back to Aang, Sokka, and Katara, his voice low and serious. I do, however, warn you not to make things difficult, he said, his gaze shifting to each of them in turn. You as well, Katara. You three have enjoyed my hospitality and been treated like human beings, but do not think of that as a weakness you might exploit. Believe me when I say you do not want to make me angry. The three exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of fear and resignation. They had seen Zuko's temper before, and they knew better than to test him. After a moment, they nodded in silent agreement. Sokka, however, couldn't resist one last question. We never revealed our names to you, he said, his tone cautious but curious. And neither did Aang. That day, how did you know our names? How did you know we would come and rescue Aang? Zuko's smile widened slightly, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the guards and gave them a curt nod. The guards stepped forward, the chains clinking as they began to bind Aang, Sokka, and Katara. The three didn't resist, their eyes locked on Zuko as they were led out of the cell one by one. As the guards escorted them down the corridor, Zuko stood silently, his arms crossed over his chest. His golden eyes followed them, his expression unreadable. He had no intention of answering Sokka's question, not yet, at least. There were some things they weren't ready to know, and some things Zuko wasn't ready to reveal. For now, his focus was on Kyoshi Island and the answers he hoped to find there. The game was far from over, and Zuko was determined to come out on top. Chapter 18, Kyoshi Island Kyoshi Warriors. The ship's hull scraped against the wooden dock as it came to a halt, the sound echoing across the quiet shoreline of Kyoshi Island. The midday sun cast a golden glow over the beach, the waves lapping gently against the sand. Zuko was the first to disembark, his boots crunching against the gravel as he stepped onto the dock. His uniform, pristine and sharp, contrasted with the raw burns and bruises that still marred his skin. Despite the pain that radiated through his body with every step, he held himself with the rigid posture of a prince, his golden eyes scanning the tree line with a calculating intensity. Behind him, 24 Fire Nation soldiers filed off the ship, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. Lieutenant G followed closely, his expression stern but alert. Aang, Katara, and Sokka were brought ashore in chains, their movements restricted but their eyes darting around, taking in their surroundings. The chains clinked with each step, a constant reminder of their captivity. Zuko stood at the edge of the beach, his gaze fixed on the dense forest that stretched up the mountainside. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The island was eerily quiet, save for the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves. But Zuko knew better. He could feel the eyes on him, watching from the shadows. "Stay vigilant," Zuko said, his voice low but commanding as he turned to Ji. "They're already here. I can't see them, but they've seen us. They're waiting in the trees." Ji nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Understood, my prince," he said, his tone steady. "We'll keep our eyes open." Zuko turned back to the forest, his expression hardening. "We're heading straight to the village," he announced, his voice carrying across the beach. "No detours. No delays." He paused, his golden eyes narrowing as he raised his voice, ensuring it reached the hidden watchers in the trees. "And if anyone tries something stupid," he added, his tone icy and deliberate, "we will burn this whole island to the ground." The warning hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. It wasn't meant for his men or the prisoners, it was a message for the Kyoshi warriors, who Zuko knew were lurking in the shadows, watching their every move. The forest remained still, but Zuko could almost feel the tension ripple through the trees. He smirked faintly, satisfied that his words had been heard. With a sharp gesture, Zuko signaled for the group to move out. The soldiers fell into formation, their footsteps crunching against the gravel as they began their march up the winding path that led to the village. Aang, Katara, and Sokka were kept in the middle of the group, their chains clinking with each step. Zuko walked at the front, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. As they ascended the mountain path, the forest grew denser, the canopy above casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the distant sound of running water echoed through the trees. But the tranquility of the island was deceptive. Every so often, shadowy figures darted through the trees, moving with impossible speed and agility. The Kyoshi warriors were there, their presence felt but not seen, their green and gold armor blending seamlessly with the foliage. Zuko's smirk widened as he noticed the fleeting glimpses of movement. He knew they were being watched, but he also knew that his warning had struck a chord. The Kyoshi warriors were skilled and fearless, but they were not reckless. They wouldn't attack unless provoked, and Zuko had made it clear that any provocation would come at a steep cost. The march continued, the path growing steeper as they climbed higher into the mountains. The soldiers remained alert, their hands resting on their weapons, their eyes scanning the trees for any sign of an ambush. Aang, Katara, and Sokka exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. They knew the Kyoshi warriors were nearby, but they also knew that Zuko's threat was not an empty one. As they rounded a bend in the path, the trees began to thin, and the first signs of the village came into view. Smoke rose in the distance, and the faint outline of rooftops could be seen through the trees. Zuko's expression hardened, his golden eyes narrowing as he focused on the task ahead. The village was close, and with it, the answers he sought. But the journey was far from over. The Kyoshi warriors were still out there, watching and waiting. Zuko knew that the real challenge lay not in reaching the village, but in what awaited him there. The game was far from over, and Zuko was determined to come out on top. The path widened as Zuko and his men approached the entrance to Kyoshi village. The dense forest gave way to a clearing, and the village came into full view. Traditional wooden houses with sloping roofs lined the streets, their walls adorned with intricate carvings and painted in earthy tones. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the faint sound of chatter and activity could be heard in the distance. But the peaceful scene was disrupted by the sight that awaited them at the village entrance. 36 Kyoshi warriors stood in formation, their green and gold armor gleaming in the sunlight. Their faces were painted in the traditional white and red makeup, their expressions stern and unyielding. Each warrior held a fan in one hand and a shield in the other, their stances poised and ready for battle. Behind them stood the village chief, an elderly man with a long white beard and a kind but wary expression. He wore simple robes, his hands clasped in front of him as he observed the approaching group. Beside him stood the leader of the Kyoshi warriors, a tall and imposing woman with sharp features and a steely gaze. Her armor was more ornate than the others, and her presence commanded respect. Behind them, a group of strong, able-bodied men from the village stood ready, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. Zuko halted his men a few paces from the village entrance, his golden eyes scanning the assembled group. He stepped forward, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. "I am Zuko," he announced, his voice firm and commanding. "Firstborn son of the Fire Lord and heir to the throne of the Fire Nation." The village chief stepped forward, his hands still clasped in front of him. "I am Chief Hana," he said, his voice calm but cautious. "And this is leader Ikari of the Kyoshi warriors. We welcome you to Kyoshi Island, Prince Zuko, but we must ask, what is the purpose of your visit?" Zuko's gaze shifted to Ikari, who stood tall and unwavering, her eyes locked on his. He could see the suspicion in her expression, the readiness to defend her people at a moment's notice. He didn't flinch. "I seek the shrine of Avatar Kyoshi," Zuko said bluntly, his voice carrying across the clearing. The words sent a ripple of murmurs through the assembled villagers and warriors. The name of Avatar Kyoshi was sacred on the island, and the idea of a Fire Nation prince seeking her shrine was unsettling. Chief Hana's brow furrowed, and he exchanged a glance with Ikari before turning back to Zuko. "Avatar Kyoshi lived over 200 years ago," the chief said, his tone measured but firm. "Her shrine is a place of reverence for our people. May I ask what you wish to do with it?" Ikari stepped forward, her voice sharp and direct. "The shrine is not a place for outsiders, especially not those who come with an army at their back. State your intentions clearly, Prince Zuko, or you will find no welcome here." Zuko's lips curled into a faint smirk, though there was no humor in it. He turned slightly and signaled to Lieutenant Ji, who stepped forward, leading Aang to the front of the group. The young Avatar's hands were bound in chains, his expression a mix of defiance and unease. Katara and Sokka were brought forward as well, their eyes darting between Zuko and the villagers. "This," Zuko said, his voice cold and deliberate, "is the Avatar." The declaration sent a shockwave through the crowd. Gasps and whispers erupted as the villagers and warriors took in the sight of the young Airbender. Chief Hana's eyes widened, and Ikari's expression hardened, her grip tightening on her fan. "The rest," Zuko continued, his tone cutting through the murmurs, "does not concern you. Now, are you going to show me the shrine of Kyoshi, or are we going to have a problem?" He took a step forward, his golden eyes locking onto Ikari's. The threat in his words was clear, his intentions unmistakable. The Kyoshi warriors shifted uneasily, their fans twitching in their hands, but Ikari raised a hand to silence them. She studied Zuko for a long moment, her gaze piercing and unyielding. "You come to our island with threats and demands," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You bring the Avatar in chains and speak of burning our home to the ground. Do you truly believe we will simply bow to your will, Prince Zuko?" Zuko's smirk widened, but his eyes remained cold. "I don't expect you to bow," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I do expect you to understand the consequences of defiance. I will have what I came for, one way or another. The choice is yours." The standoff stretched on, the tension thick enough to cut with a blade. The villagers and warriors exchanged uneasy glances, their hands tightening on their weapons. Chief Hana stepped forward, his expression grave. "Prince Zuko," he said, his voice steady but cautious, "we are a peaceful people, but we will not be bullied. If you seek the shrine of Avatar Kyoshi, you will do so with respect. Any act of violence will be met with equal force." Zuko's gaze shifted to the chief, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing, the silence stretching between them. Then, he gave a curt nod. "Very well," he said, his voice low. "Lead me to the shrine. And remember, I am not a patient man. Akari's jaw tightened, but she stepped aside, signaling for her warriors to do the same. The path to the shrine was clear, but the tension in the air remained. Zuko's men fell into formation behind him, their weapons at the ready, as the villagers and warriors watched with wary eyes. The game was far from over, and Zuko knew that the real challenge lay ahead. But for now, he had what he wanted. The shrine of Avatar Kyoshi was within his reach, and with it, the answers he sought. Chapter 19, Kyoshi Island, Avatar Kyoshi. The tension at the village entrance was thick, the air heavy with unspoken threats and wary glances. Akari stepped forward, her voice firm and commanding as she addressed Zuko. "Only you and the Avatar may enter the village," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "The rest of your men will remain outside. This is not a negotiation." Chief Hannah nodded in agreement, his expression grave but resolute. "Kyoshi Island has stayed out of the war," he added, his voice steady. "And we intend to keep it that way. We will not allow your soldiers to march through our streets." Zuko's golden eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave a curt nod. "As long as everyone behaves," he said, his voice cold and measured, "then Kyoshi will remain as insignificant as it always has." He turned to Lieutenant G, his tone sharp and authoritative. "Lieutenant, you will remain here with the girl and the boy," he said, gesturing to Katara and Sokka. "Keep them under guard, but do not provoke the villagers. If anything happens, you will answer to me." G nodded, his expression grim. "Understood, my prince," he said, stepping back to take his position with the rest of the soldiers. Akari turned to her warriors, her gaze sweeping over them until it landed on a young woman with sharp features and a determined expression. "Suki," she said, her voice firm, "you will keep an eye on the Fire Nation soldiers with the rest of the warriors. Do not engage unless provoked." Suki stepped forward, her green and gold armor gleaming in the sunlight. Her face was painted in the traditional white and red makeup, and her eyes were sharp and focused. "Understood, Leader Akari," she said, her voice steady and confident. Zuko's gaze shifted to Suki as she spoke, his golden eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. He muttered under his breath, his voice low enough that only he could hear. "So, she must be Suki," he said, his tone thoughtful. "She's as beautiful as I expected." A flicker of irritation crossed his mind as he thought about Sokka. Sokka was one lucky bastard, he cursed silently, knowing that in another timeline, the Water Tribe boy would have won Suki's affection. The thought gnawed at him, and for a brief moment, he entertained the idea of pursuing her himself. Maybe I could have Suki, he thought, his lips curling into a faint smirk. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come. Zuko shook his head slightly, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't afford to get lost in his thoughts, not now. Not when so much was at stake. "Please follow me, Prince Zuko," Akari said, her voice sharp and commanding, snapping him out of his reverie. Zuko blinked, realizing that everyone was staring at him, his men, the villagers, even Aang. He had been caught looking at Suki, and the weight of their gazes was unmistakable. But Zuko was nothing if not practiced in the art of composure. He straightened his posture, his expression hardening as he pretended not to notice the stares. "Lead the way," he said curtly, his voice cold and dismissive. He grabbed hold of Aang's chains, pulling the young Avatar forward as they began to follow Akari through the village. The streets of Kyoshi village were lined with curious onlookers, men, women, and children who had gathered to witness the strange and unsettling sight of the Fire Nation prince and the Avatar in chains. Whispers and murmurs followed them as they walked, the villagers' eyes wide with a mix of fear, anger, and curiosity. Some of the children pointed at Aang, their voices hushed but excited, while others stared at Zuko with undisguised hostility. Zuko ignored them all, his gaze fixed straight ahead as he focused on maintaining his composure. He could feel the weight of their stares, the tension in the air, but he refused to let it distract him. He had a mission, and he wouldn't let anything, or anyone, get in his way. Aang, however, seemed more affected by the attention. His shoulders slumped, and his head hung low as he walked, the chains clinking with each step. The sight of the villagers' reactions clearly weighed on him, and Zuko could see the guilt and sorrow etched into the young Avatar's expression. "Keep moving," Zuko said sharply, giving Aang's chains a slight tug. "We don't have time for your self-pity." Aang glanced up at Zuko, his gray eyes filled with a mix of defiance and despair, but he said nothing. He simply kept walking, his steps slow and deliberate. As they made their way through the village, Zuko's mind wandered briefly to the incident earlier, when he had been caught staring at Suki. He cursed himself inwardly for letting his guard down. He couldn't afford to lose focus, not when so much was at stake. The last thing he needed was to be distracted by thoughts of a girl, no matter how beautiful she was. "Stay focused," he reminded himself, his jaw tightening as he pushed the thoughts aside. You have a mission. Nothing else matters, Akari led them through the winding streets, her posture tall and confident as she guided them toward the shrine of Avatar Kyoshi. The villagers continued to watch, their whispers growing louder as the group passed by. But Zuko paid them no mind. His golden eyes remained fixed on the path ahead, his expression unreadable. The shrine was close, and with it, the answers he sought. Zuko's grip on Aang's chains tightened as they walked, his determination unwavering. The game was far from over, and he was determined to come out on top. The group reached the edge of the village, where the path opened up to reveal a towering wooden statue of Avatar Kyoshi. The statue stood at least 30 feet tall, its intricate carvings capturing every detail of the legendary Avatar's imposing presence. Her face was stern and regal, her eyes seemingly alive with a piercing gaze. The statue's hands were clasped in front of her, holding a fan that was almost as tall as Zuko himself. Behind the statue, a large open building housed a myriad of Kyoshi artifacts, scrolls, weapons, and relics from the Avatar's time. As they approached the statue, both Zuko and Aang seemed momentarily mesmerized by its grandeur. Zuko's golden eyes narrowed as he studied the statue, his expression unreadable but his mind racing. Aang, on the other hand, looked up at the statue with a mix of awe and reverence, his gray eyes wide as he took in the sight of his predecessor. But before either of them could speak, the statue's eyes suddenly glowed with a blinding light. A beam of energy shot out from the statue, engulfing Aang in a blazing aura. Zuko and Akari raised their hands to shield their eyes, the light so intense that it forced them to look away. The air around them crackled with energy, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. When the light finally faded, Zuko and Akari lowered their hands, their eyes widening in shock. Standing before them was no longer Aang, but Avatar Kyoshi herself. She was tall and imposing, her green and gold robes flowing as if caught in an invisible breeze. Her face was painted in the traditional Kyoshi warrior makeup, and her eyes glowed with the power of the Avatar state. The chains that had bound Aang lay shattered on the ground, reduced to nothing more than broken links. Zuko stared at Kyoshi, his golden eyes wide with disbelief. He had expected many things, but this was not one of them. The villagers and warriors who had followed them gasped, their voices a mixture of fear and reverence. Even Akari, the leader of the Kyoshi warriors, seemed momentarily stunned, her usual composure shaken by the sight of her legendary predecessor. "Arrogant fool," Kyoshi said, her voice deep and commanding, echoing with the power of the Avatar state. Her glowing eyes locked onto Zuko, and with a flick of her wrist, she summoned a gust of wind that sent him flying into a nearby building. Zuko grunted as he hit the wall, the impact sending a fresh wave of pain through his already battered body. He slid to the ground, his muscles screaming in protest as he struggled to stand. "Damn it," he cursed, his voice filled with frustration and pain. "What the hell, Kyoshi? I just wanted to talk." Kyoshi stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I will not listen to what you have to say," she said, her voice cold and unyielding. "You do not belong in this world." Zuko's eyes widened at her words, his mind racing. How does she know, he thought, his heart pounding in his chest. Is this some Avatar ability? He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. It didn't matter how she knew, what mattered was that she did. "I wasn't planning on attacking your people," Kyoshi, Zuko said, his voice calm but laced with a cold edge. He turned to the onlookers, his golden eyes sweeping over the villagers and warriors. But don't make me change my mind. Kyoshi's eyes narrowed, her expression darkening. You dare threaten the Avatar? She asked, her voice rising with anger. Knowing I could take your life from you at any moment? Zuko stared at her, his jaw clenched as he fought through the pain. His body was still recovering from Zhao's lightning attack, and now this. But despite the pain, a small part of him was glad he had come here. It meant his thinking had been right. There was something more at play here, something he needed to understand. I simply wish to speak with you privately, Zuko said, his voice firm but measured. Then you can decide on your next course of action. Kyoshi studied him for a long moment, her glowing eyes piercing through him. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the tension palpable. Finally, she nodded. Very well, she said, her voice calm but still carrying the weight of her authority. I will speak with you. Before Zuko could respond, the world around him blurred, the colors and shapes melting into a chaotic swirl. He felt a strange sensation, as if he were being pulled through time and space. When the blurriness cleared, he found himself standing in a dense forest. The air was cool and fresh, and the sounds of the village were gone, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Zuko looked down at his hands, his eyes widening in surprise. The burns and bruises that had marred his skin were gone. He felt fresh. Strong. He ran a hand over his chest, feeling the smooth, unblemished skin beneath his fingers. This wasn't Zuko's body, not the one he had been living in since he arrived in this world. This was his body. The body he had on Earth. He looked up as Kyoshi stepped into view, her presence as commanding as ever. Her glowing eyes locked onto his, and she crossed her arms over her chest. Here we are, foreigner, she said, her voice calm but firm. Now speak. The tension hanging in the air as Zuko prepares to confront the legendary Avatar in a place where the rules of the world no longer apply. The game has changed, and Zuko knows that the stakes have never been higher. Chapter 20, Kyoshi Island, Victor Crane. The forest around them was eerily silent, the air thick with an otherworldly energy. Victor stood before Avatar Kyoshi, his modern Armani suit starkly out of place in this ancient, mystical setting. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his posture relaxed but his expression serious. Kyoshi loomed over him, her towering presence commanding respect, her glowing eyes piercing through him as if she could see every secret he had ever tried to hide. The man took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to explain the impossible. He glanced at Kyoshi, then at the confused Aang, who had just appeared out of nowhere, his gray eyes wide with bewilderment. Kyoshi, what is going on? Aang asked, his voice trembling with confusion. He turned to Victor, his brow furrowed as he took in the man's strange appearance. Who are you? And why are you dressed so oddly? The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. My name is Victor Crane, he said, his voice calm but firm. And yeah, I know the suit looks weird. It's from where I come from. Aang blinked, his confusion only deepening. Victor Crane? That's an odd name, he said, tilting his head slightly. Where are we? Am I dead? Where's Prince Zuko? And the villagers? What about Katara and Sokka? Are they okay? I need to go back. Calm down, Aang, Victor interrupted, his voice sharp and annoyed. He held up a hand to stop the barrage of questions. They'll be fine. You're not dead. We're in the spirit world, or something like that. I don't have all the answers, okay? Aang frowned, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. Oh, I'm sorry, Victor Crane. It's just my friends. It's not Victor Crane, Victor snapped, cutting him off again. It's Victor Crane. Crane is my family name, and Victor is my actual name. Got it? Aang's eyes widened, and he nodded slowly. A family name? Well, that's odd, he said, his tone thoughtful. But I guess that's the least of the odd things about you. Kyoshi crossed her arms, her glowing eyes narrowing as she looked at Victor. Indeed, she said, her voice cold and commanding. Now, Victor Crane, explain yourself. What is going on here? And why have you brought the Avatar into this? Victor sighed, running a hand over his face. He was starting to get annoyed with all the questions, but he knew he had to explain. All right, kid, he said, turning to Aang. Let me break it down for you. I'm not from this world. I'm from another place. A completely different world. I died there, got hit by a truck, long story, and somehow, I woke up here. In the body of Zuko. He paused, letting the words sink in. Aang's eyes widened, and he took a step back, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. Wait, so you're saying you're not from this world? And you woke up in Prince Zuko's body? But that doesn't make any sense. What happened to the real Zuko? Is he gone? Victor shook his head, his frustration growing. I don't know, okay? I don't have all the answers. All I know is that I died in my world, and when I woke up, I was in Zuko's body. I don't know where his spirit is, or if he's even still around. I'm just trying to figure this out as I go. Aang stared at him, his mind clearly struggling to process everything. So, the Zuko who captured me, who's been chasing me this whole time, that was really you? Victor nodded, his expression grim. Yeah, that was me. But it's not like I had a choice, kid. I woke up in his body, in his life. I didn't ask for this. Aang's confusion only seemed to grow. But, why? How? How did you even end up here? And why are you in Zuko's body? What does this mean for the balance of the world? What about? Enough! Kyoshi's voice boomed, cutting through the air like a thunderclap. Her glowing eyes burned with intensity as she stepped forward, her presence overwhelming. Victor Crane, you will explain yourself fully. Now. No more evasions, no more half-truths. What is your purpose here? And why have you brought the Avatar into this? Victor clenched his jaw, his annoyance bubbling over. I'm trying to explain, okay? But it's not exactly easy to sum up I died and woke up in a cartoon character's body in a few sentences. Kyoshi's eyes narrowed, even more confused by his words, and she took another step forward, her towering figure looming over him. You will speak clearly, or I will force the truth from you. Victor held up his hands in a placating gesture, though his expression was anything but calm. All right. Look, I am from another world. I died there, and somehow, I ended up here. In Zuko's body. I don't know how or why, but I'm here. And now I'm trying to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with this mess. Happy? Aang's eyes were wide, his mind clearly reeling from the information. So, you're from another world, and you're possessing Zuko's body? But, what does that mean for him? Is he still in there somewhere? And what about the Fire Nation? What about? Enough! Victor's voice cut through the air. I have already explained this and it is getting annoying. He stood in the ethereal forest of the spirit world, the weight of his revelations hanging heavily in the air. Aang and Kyoshi stared at him, their expressions a mix of shock, confusion, and curiosity. The silence stretched for a moment before Victor finally broke it, his voice calm but firm. I know about this world because I've seen it before, he began, his words measured. In my world, your lives, your struggles, your victories, they were all stories. Tales told to entertain and inspire. I know how the war started, who started it, and why. I know about the first Avatar, one, and the cycle that followed. I know about the next Avatar after Aang. I've seen it all unfold, as stories. Aang's eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly as he tried to process what Victor was saying. Stories, he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. You mean, you've seen our lives as tales? Victor nodded. Yes. In my world, we have these things called stories. They're like legends, but told in a way that people can watch or read. And your life, Aang, was one of those stories. I know how the war started, how it was supposed to end, and who was involved. But things aren't exactly as I remember them. Kyoshi's glowing eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable but her curiosity evident. Explain, she said, her voice commanding. Victor took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to find the right words. For example, he said, turning to Aang, you saw how badly I was injured yesterday when I fought that firebender, Zhao. In the stories, Zhao was never supposed to be that strong. In fact, Zuko, the real Zuko, defeated him, and they ended up hating each other for a while until Zhao was killed by you, Aang. But here, Zhao was stronger. He nearly killed me. Things are different now, and I don't know why. Aang's eyes widened further, his mind clearly reeling from the implications. So, you've seen the outcome of the war? You know how things are supposed to end? Victor nodded again. Yes. I know how it's supposed to go. But like I said, things aren't the same. Someone, or something, is changing the rules. Kyoshi stepped forward, her towering presence looming over Victor. How much do you know about me? She asked, her voice low and intense. About the past avatars? Victor met her gaze, his expression serious. I know a fair bit about you, Kyoshi. I know about Avatar Kuruk before you, and how he spent most of his time fighting dark spirits in the spirit world, which is why the physical world was such a mess during your era. I know about Avatar Yangchen before Kuruk and her adventures. But I know very little about Avatar Sito before her. The stories I saw were mostly about Aang and the Avatar who came after him. Kyoshi's eyes narrowed, her expression thoughtful. And why reveal this now? She asked, her tone sharp. What do you hope to gain by telling us this? Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. I need the Avatar's help, he said simply. In the stories, Aang was able to communicate with the past Avatars at their shrines. I thought Roku would be the ideal choice because of his dealings with spirits, but the closest shrine was yours, Kyoshi. So here we are. Aang frowned, his confusion evident. But why do you need my help? What does this have to do with me? Kyoshi crossed her arms, her expression equally puzzled. Yes, Victor Crane. The Avatar is the bridge between the physical and spirit worlds, but even I cannot claim to fully understand the spirit world. What do you expect the Avatar to do about a powerful spirit, if that is indeed what we're dealing with? Victor smiled faintly, his expression enigmatic. I'll tell Aang when he's ready, he said cryptically. For now, let's just say that I need to return to the Fire Nation capital with the Avatar captured. Once there, I can reclaim my rights as the prince and gain the resources I need to truly understand what's going on. Aang's eyes widened, and he took a step back. Is that why you had me in chains? He demanded, his voice rising. And captured Appa too, and Sokka and Katara. Of course, Victor answered matter-of-factly. I need you to play your part, Aang. Once I've reclaimed my rights to the throne and gained the trust of Fire Lord Ozai, I'll let you go so you can master the 4 elements by the end of the summer. Aang's brow furrowed, his confusion deepening. Why the end of the summer? He asked. Victor didn't answer immediately, his expression thoughtful. Just trust me, he said finally. I'm not the real Zuko, Aang. No matter how much I play the part, I'm not him. But even in the stories, it was Zuko who taught you firebending and helped you defeat the Fire Lord. I'm not your enemy. Aang turned to Kyoshi, his expression uncertain. Should I trust him? He asked, his voice hesitant. Kyoshi studied Victor for a long moment, her glowing eyes piercing through him. Finally, she nodded. Trust him, Aang, she said, her voice firm. But if he tries anything, the Avatar spirit will take care of him and send him back to where he belongs. Aang nodded slowly, his expression resolute. All right, he said, turning back to Victor. I'll trust you. For now. With that, Aang vanished from the forest, leaving Victor and Kyoshi alone. The air between them was thick with tension, the silence stretching for a moment before Kyoshi finally spoke. "Now," she said, her voice low and intense, "tell me what you think the Avatar has to do with all of this. And why you wanted to contact Roku over me." Her tone carried a hint of jealousy, which Victor noticed but chose not to comment on. Victor met her gaze, his expression serious. "The real reason I wanted to talk to you," he said, "is because of the origins of the Avatar." The weight of Victor's words were left hanging in the air as Kyoshi's glowing eyes bore into him, her curiosity and suspicion evident. The truth about the Avatar's origins, and Victor's true intentions, remained shrouded in mystery, but the stage was set for a deeper revelation. That's the end of this tale for now. Like and subscribe for part 2 to be out as fast as possible, and with that being said, I'll see you on the next one. Peace.